Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world that probably feels a little too orderly to survive. But somehow, here you are, barefoot in a courtyard that hasn't heard a laugh in centuries. You step past the heavy monastery gates just as the first light of dawn spills over rough stone walls, brushing the moss that clings stubbornly to the edges. The air smells faintly of wet earth and old incense, a combination that makes you both want to sneeze and take a deep, contemplative breath at the same time. You probably won't survive this if you're the type who needs constant stimulation, but luckily, you only need one thing tonight: patience. Your footsteps echo against cobblestones polished by countless mornings like this one. A thin mist curls around the spires, catching the orange sun and turning it into soft, liquid gold. You notice small details. A sparrow perched on the rim of a gargoyle, its tiny claws clutching stone like it owns the place. A wheelbarrow left leaning against the wall, slightly rotted, probably decades old. Scholars still argue whether these monks preferred morning silence over the warmth of beds, but you feel the answer in the cool air brushing your face. Silence is a form of devotion here. As you wander closer to the main courtyard, your eyes adjust to the dim light, catching the outlines of cloistered arches. You see shapes moving behind them. Monks in simple brown robes, their heads bowed, hands tucked into long sleeves. They hum a low, melodic chant, each note vibrating softly against the stones, mingling with the morning breeze. The sound makes you instinctively slow your pace. Oddly, one of the monks seems to carry a tiny wooden bell, like a miniature doorbell, that he rings whenever a newcomer, like you, passes the thresholds. It's almost comical, and yet, somehow, reverent. You follow a narrow path lined with flowering herbs. Even at this early hour, the sense of thyme, lavender, and something pungent you can't quite place mingle in the air. A crow caws in the distance, startling a nearby cat who scurries along the wall, tail puffed like a miniature broom. The sun climbs higher, and golden shafts highlight the imperfections in the walls, cracks, chipped stone, and a faint graffiti-like scratch. Here lies someone bored. You smile. The past has a sense of humor too. Your hands brush the cool stone as you walk, fingers trailing along carved patterns that have faded but still tell stories, maybe of saints, maybe of bored novices doodling during long hours. Scholars still debate the purpose of some carvings. Were they meditative aids, secret messages, or just the artistic whims of someone with too much time and too little supervision? You'll never know for sure, and somehow, that uncertainty is soothing. The air vibrates faintly with the murmur of early morning chores. A broom scraping against stone, a bucket of water being lifted and poured, a door creaking. It is the sound of a world waking slowly. You pause at the edge of the courtyard, watching a few monks sweep the ground with long, straw brooms. One of them glances at you briefly, offering a subtle nod. You return it, feeling an odd sense of inclusion in this silent fraternity. By now, the sky has lightened to a soft blue, and you notice the shadows moving differently. The spire casts a long, stretching shadow over the garden plots, a slow clock of time that ticks without noise. You hear the faintest drip of water somewhere distant, like a metronome marking the rhythm of the morning. And in this moment, you feel suspended, not quite in the present, not entirely in the past, but hovering in the delicate space between, where history is something you walk through, not just read about. You take a deep breath, savoring the mixture of stone, herb, and incense. The chill in the air makes your senses sharper. You feel the rough texture of the stone walls beneath your fingers, hear the distant rustle of leaves, catch the fleeting scent of someone's early morning tea, probably a simple herbal concoction. You glance at the gargoyle again, and it seems almost alive, staring back at you with the faint suggestion of judgment. Or maybe amusement. You can't decide. The courtyard opens into a larger square, where the sound of a bell echoes from a distant tower. You realize it is calling monks to their first tasks of the day, though the sound is more hypnotic than urgent. You move toward it, drawn by rhythm and light, letting your thoughts drift. Scholars still argue whether the first bells were meant to control time or consciousness, but for you, it just feels like the pulse of a world both rigid and oddly comforting. Your shadow stretches long across the cobblestones as you walk, brushing the edges of ancient carvings and tiny fountains. Water trickles from one of them in a soft, melodic pattern, lulling your mind into that drowsy, half-awake state perfect for listening to stories, for wandering in imagination. You notice the tiniest things. The shimmer of morning dew on a moss-covered ledge, the flicker of sunlight through a small arched window, the way a breeze disturbs a thin curtain like a whisper. The moment is intimate, almost secretive. You feel the pulse of life here, the slow, measured heartbeat of a monastery waking, a day beginning. You are part of it, yet apart. Your senses strain gently, aware of textures, sounds, and smells you rarely notice in the modern rush. Even the cold morning stone underfoot feels like a lesson in patience. You notice a discarded quill near a doorway, brittle and blackened with ink residue, and for a fleeting second, imagine the hands that used it, the texts it wrote, the prayers it traced in flowing script. Time seems to stretch. You move slowly, almost ceremoniously, past the courtyard fountain and into a narrower passage where sunlight falls in golden ribbons. The warmth is unexpected but welcome. The monastery feels alive yet untouched by the chaos of the outside world. You feel your own breathing slow, your heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of this place. And though the morning has just begun, you sense that you are in for a day that unfolds differently than any modern schedule could allow. In this quiet entry, the monastery gates behind you seem less like barriers and more like a gentle invitation. You feel your mind clearing, the weight of distractions outside melting away with each careful step. There is a strange comfort in knowing that for now, you belong to the slow pulse of stone, chant, and mist. And somewhere, just beyond the archways, the first hints of the day's stories wait to be discovered, patiently, quietly, like secrets shared only with those willing to wander slowly enough to notice. You wander barefoot through the cloister, the chill of early morning seeping into your toes and reminding you that comfort isn't exactly the monastery's priority. The stones are smooth from centuries of traffic, yet uneven enough that you're constantly aware of every step. Each echo of your footfall stretches through the arches, a hollow sound that feels both intimate and haunting. Scholars still argue whether the monks intentionally built cloisters to amplify sound, but right now, you're more concerned with keeping your balance than solving architectural debates. The air is thick with the scent of damp stone and herbs drying on racks nearby. Tiny critters scuttle along the edges of walls, perhaps mice or lizards, or maybe the occasional overconfident snail. You glance down at one slowly making its deliberate journey across a sunlit patch of cobblestone. Oddly, it seems unbothered by your presence, as if you're just another part of the quiet tableau. There's a lesson in that patience, you think, though it's hard not to compare yourself to the hurried creatures outside the monastery gates, forever racing against time. As you move deeper into the cloister, the columns rise like ancient sentinels, their carved capitals telling stories that your modern eyes struggle to interpret. One column shows a tiny figure wrestling with a lion, or maybe it's a metaphor for temptation. Another depicts a monk handing a loaf of bread to a shadowy figure. You wonder if the sculptor intended to warn, to inspire, or merely to amuse himself during long days of labor. Scholars still debate whether medieval carvings were primarily moral guides or secret jokes hidden in stone. You smile at the idea of humor stretching across centuries, tickling your imagination. A breeze slips through the open arches, carrying whispers of leaves and the distant clang of the bell tower. You feel it lift the edges of your robe slightly, a reminder that even in this rigid routine, nature has its say. Tiny droplets of dew cling stubbornly to the moss, shimmering like miniature stars when the sun finally pierces the morning haze. You step carefully, almost reverently, letting your hands skim along the cold stone walls, noticing tiny scratches and etched initials from generations long gone. Each mark feels like a conversation with someone you'll never meet. You pause near a small garden nestled within the cloister. Rows of herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender, are meticulously arranged, the soil dark and rich. You kneel for a moment, inhaling deeply. The aroma is heady, slightly pungent, yet strangely comforting. A monk bends over the plants nearby, clipping leaves with precise, almost surgical motions. His face is serene, absorbed in the rhythm of cultivation. Oddly, he carries a small wooden comb tucked into his robe. Scholars still argue whether combs were purely practical or sometimes symbolic, perhaps representing order or self-discipline. You can't decide, but it amuses you to imagine that this tiny tool carries some secret monastic meaning. The cloister seems to stretch endlessly, an enclosed labyrinth of arches, stone benches, and small alcoves. Sunlight plays tricks through the arches, forming shifting patterns on the cobblestones. You notice a tiny snail inching along one of the shadowed grooves, leaving behind a glistening trail. You watch it for a moment, captivated by its patient journey. It's so slow, so deliberate, yet it reaches its destination without complaint. The thought makes you reflect on your own pace in life. Here, there is no rush, no pressing deadlines, just movement, measured and intentional. Somewhere nearby, you hear the faint murmur of water from a small fountain tucked into a corner. The soft, repetitive trickle blends with the wind through the arches, forming a subtle lullaby. Your eyes follow the fountain's flow, noticing the worn stone and tiny chips along its edge, the work of countless hands over centuries. You imagine young novices dipping their fingers into the cool water, the ritual simultaneously refreshing and meditative. Scholars still debate whether fountains were installed primarily for ritual cleansing or purely aesthetic pleasure, but in this moment, it hardly matters. The sound alone slows your heartbeat. The cloister walls are dotted with tiny niches, each once home to statues or candles. Some remain empty, others house weathered figures of saints with chipped noses and faded faces. You pause before one, tracing the outline of its features. Its eyes seem to follow you, not in a creepy way, but as though it is quietly judging your wandering thoughts. Perhaps it's a reminder that even in moments of idleness, observation and mindfulness are never far. You chuckle softly. You are both intruder and guest, a participant in centuries-old routines. You continue walking, noticing small details that would escape most casual observers. A faint trail of soot near the fireplace alcove, tiny footprints in the dust near the stone steps, a carved bird perched just above an arch, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. Each little discovery feels intimate, like the monastery itself is slowly revealing secrets to you. Oddly, you feel as though these secrets have always existed just for the patient and curious, for those willing to move slowly enough to notice. The morning grows lighter, and shadows shrink into themselves, creating a patchwork of warmth and coolness along the cobblestones. You reach a stone bench tucked into a corner of the cloister. Sitting down, you notice the texture, rough yet smoothed in places by the hands of countless monks over generations. You imagine resting here, letting your thoughts drift, your attention pulled gently by the rhythm of daily life unfolding all around. Scholars still debate whether cloisters were designed to promote introspection or merely to create practical circulation space, but in this quiet, reflective moment, the difference feels irrelevant. Birdsong begins to filter through the arches, mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. You hear a monk humming as he prunes a plant, the melody blending with the natural sounds into an unexpectedly hypnotic symphony. Tiny insects buzz faintly near flowering herbs, undeterred by the humans navigating their domain. You lean back against the stone bench, feeling the coolness seep into your spine. There's a strange pleasure in the blend of tactile sensation, faint sounds, and filtered sunlight, the simple richness of sensory experience unhurried by time. As you rise to continue your walk, you notice a small stone stairway leading to the upper gallery of the cloister. You climb slowly, each step creaking faintly under your weight, aware of the vast expanse opening below you. From this vantage point, the courtyard looks like a miniature world, alive with shadow and light, quiet activity, and the occasional movement of small creatures. You feel suspended, neither fully inside nor outside, observing a rhythm that predates modern schedules, modern noise, modern hurry. At the far end of the gallery, you discover a tiny alcove with a bench, a single candle stub, and an old manuscript left open, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. Oddly, it seems placed deliberately, as if waiting for someone to notice, to read, to absorb. Scholars still argue whether monks left marginalia as instruction, entertainment, or secret commentary, but right now, it feels like an invitation into a slower, more mindful existence. You step back, taking in the arches stretching behind and ahead of you. Each curve and line is purposeful yet calming, directing movement, sound, and attention in subtle ways. You notice your own shadow, elongated by the morning sun, stretching across stone like a companion that moves in slow motion alongside you. You realize that the rhythm of the cloister has begun to enter your body, syncing with your heartbeat, your breathing, your mind. With one last glance at the gallery, you descend the stairs and continue along the cloister path, now moving with awareness rather than necessity. Each step, each breath, each observation feels intentional. You notice the way the light has shifted again, forming new patterns on the worn stone. A gentle wind rustles through a cluster of herbs, carrying their scent into your path, blending rosemary, lavender, and something earthy that you can't quite name. You inhale deeply, letting it fill your lungs, calming your thoughts. By now, you feel part of the cloister, though in the gentlest, most fleeting way. You are both observer and participant, visitor and inhabitant of this slow-moving, sunlit world. The cold stone underfoot, the quiet chorus of sounds, the subtle movement of light and shadow, all of it forms a tapestry in which your presence is acknowledged yet unobtrusive. Even the tiny snail has long since vanished, leaving only its glistening trail behind, a small testament to the passage of time and effort unnoticed. As you approach the far end of the cloister, the arches begin to open into a broader courtyard, signaling the transition to the next phase of the monk's day. Your bare feet have grown accustomed to the chill, your senses sharpened by the attentiveness this walk demanded. And as you step out, leaving the cloister behind, you carry with you a subtle rhythm, the pulse of careful movement, mindful observation, and the quiet satisfaction of experiencing a world designed to slow everything down. You drift toward the chapel, following the faint vibration of a chant that seems to float effortlessly through the monastery walls. The sound is low and melodic, rising and falling like waves brushing against a distant shore. You probably won't survive this if your modern mind demands constant noise and distraction, but tonight, the subtle cadence draws you in, urging you to slow, to listen, to feel. Scholars still argue whether the early morning chants were designed for spiritual devotion, acoustical perfection, or simply to keep sleepy monks awake, but in this moment, the reasoning doesn't matter, you are immersed. As you approach the darkened doorway, the smell of incense drifts out, mingling with the faint chill of stone and the subtle aroma of morning candles. Your hand brushes the cool wooden frame, and you pause, noticing tiny carvings in the worn wood, perhaps the initials of monks who once passed this way centuries ago. One of the carvings looks almost like a small heart, and you smile at the thought of a monk daring a small, secret flourish amid the strict rules of the day. Oddly comforting, isn't it? That even in rigid routines, humans always find room for a bit of personality. Inside, the chapel is dimly lit, with shafts of sunlight sneaking in through high, narrow windows. Dust motes float lazily in the beams, sparkling like miniature stars suspended in still air. You step carefully over the stone floor, aware of every sound, the soft scrape of your foot, the quiet rustle of robe against robe, the gentle hum of voices forming words you don't yet understand. You pause near a pew and take a deep breath, letting the smell of old wood, stone, and incense fill your lungs. It's grounding, almost intoxicating in its simplicity. The monks' chanting begins in earnest, a slow and steady rhythm that seems to breathe with the space itself. You notice the subtle variations. One monk's voice is slightly higher, another resonates with a quiet depth that seems to echo off the walls and into your chest. Scholars still debate whether these harmonics were intentional or simply a happy accident of collective practice, but as you stand there, enveloped in sound, you feel the truth in it regardless. The vibration settles your thoughts, slows your heartbeat, and carries you gently into an altered state of awareness. You drift further in, finding a place near the back, where the floor feels cooler and the scent of incense is richer. One monk, seated a few rows ahead, clutches a tiny wooden bookstand, the pages of his prayer book worn and smoothed by decades of repeated readings. He murmurs each line with devotion, barely moving his lips, yet the sound blends seamlessly with the others to form an ethereal chorus. You notice a faint shimmer of candle wax along the edges of the altar, a reminder that countless hands have tended this place, each flame a flickering witness to years of devotion and repetition. A soft wind sneaks through an open window, lifting the thin edges of the choir books like gentle wings. You hear the faintest creak of the wooden floor beneath a monk's shifting weight. A small bird taps at a distant ledge, its presence barely audible against the chant, yet it adds a tiny, unpredictable note to the scene. You think about how odd it is that even in the strictest environments, life finds a way to slip in, a reminder that perfection is always tinged with imperfection. Odd, yes, but beautiful. You glance toward the altar and see the flicker of candlelight on the carved figures of saints. One figure's eyes seem almost to follow you, not in menace, but in quiet curiosity. You imagine the countless monks who have knelt here, day after day, performing the same ritual gestures, uttering the same words, seeking the same solace. Scholars still argue whether the repetition of prayer is primarily meditative or disciplinary, but for you, it is a lullaby of a different sort, one that encourages the mind to drift gently toward calm, toward sleep, toward reflection. As the chant continues, you become aware of your own breathing. It syncs, almost imperceptibly, with the monk's rhythm, the inhale rising, the exhale falling, the gentle vibration of sound and space resonating in your chest. The act of listening becomes immersive. You feel like part of a larger, living organism, a single note in a long, evolving chord that stretches across time. Tiny details emerge. The faint clink of a monk's ring as he moves his hand, the subtle rustle of fabric, the way sunlight glances off the metal of a small lectern. Each detail, minor on its own, combines to form a rich tapestry of sensation and attention. You notice a small, almost comical quirk. One monk occasionally fidgets with the edge of his robe, tugging it down in a motion so subtle that you almost doubt your own eyes. You can't help but smile. Even in centuries-old rituals, human behavior sneaks in, small gestures that reveal the individuality beneath layers of obedience and routine. Scholars still debate whether these quirks were considered distractions or merely human. You decide it doesn't matter. They add life to the solemnity, a reminder that history is inhabited, not just observed. Your attention drifts to the faint outlines of faces in the morning light. The monks' expressions are serene, focused, some with eyes closed, some peering down at the pages before them. You feel a pang of respect. Here, devotion is both rigorous and deeply personal, a discipline entwined with the human heart. The chant swells slightly, each voice contributing to the overall resonance, a sound that is both grounding and uplifting. You let it wash over you, noticing how it seems to carry the weight of centuries without burdening you with the specifics of doctrine or belief. Somewhere nearby, a candle gutter flickers, sending shadows dancing across the stone walls. You watch the movement, hypnotized by the interplay of light and darkness. The flicker reminds you that even in the quietest moments, change is constant, subtle, and beautiful. A faint, lingering scent of beeswax reminds you of the careful craftsmanship that went into preparing these spaces, simple acts that are at once functional and sacred. Scholars still argue whether candlelight was considered symbolic of divine presence or primarily practical, but in your mind, it carries both. As the chant winds to a softer, more lingering finish, you notice the collective inhalation, the tiny shifting of feet, the subtle adjustment of robes as the monks prepare to transition. The chapel seems to sigh with them, the sound of centuries embedded in every stone, every carved detail, every flickering flame. You feel the space holding you gently, letting you linger in the stillness before life resumes its measured rhythm. You take a moment to close your eyes, letting the resonance linger in your ears. The sensation is almost tactile, as if the sound itself is brushing against your skin. You picture the sun climbing higher outside, casting more light into the chapel, revealing dust particles suspended like tiny constellations. A small bat flits near the rafters, almost invisible, reminding you that life continues quietly, unseen. Odd, yes, but perfectly natural. You rise to leave, noticing that your bare feet have grown accustomed to the cool stone, your senses sharpened by the attentive listening. As you step toward the doorway, the morning air greets you again with a gentle chill, the scent of dew and herbs mingling with the residual incense. You realize that the chant has left a subtle imprint on your mind, a rhythm, a calm, a gentle reminder that time can be measured in sound, in breath, in the quiet accumulation of small, intentional acts. And as you step back into the cloister light, you carry with you the lingering echo of the monks' voices, the scent of wax and stone, and the subtle understanding that devotion, however defined, has a texture you can touch, a sound you can hear, and a rhythm you can feel. You are a guest here, yes, but one who has glimpsed the intimacy of daily life in a world suspended between stone, sound, and quiet human ritual. You drift toward the scriptorium, where silence carries the weight of centuries. The room is long and narrow, lit by tall, narrow windows that filter sunlight in soft golden bars across rough wooden desks. The air smells faintly of ink, parchment, and old dust, a mixture that is oddly soothing, like the scent of a library that has never been disturbed by careless hands. Scholars still argue whether monks primarily copied texts for devotion, education, or preservation, but as you step inside, you realize that purpose barely matters here, the act itself is mesmerizing. Your bare feet make almost no sound on the worn wooden floor as you move closer to a cluster of desks. You notice the meticulous arrangement, each desk equipped with ink pots, quills, and small knives for scraping mistakes. A faint scratch of quill on parchment greets your ears, steady and deliberate. One monk pauses mid-stroke, adjusting his posture with precision before continuing. You watch the movement, oddly hypnotized by the blend of physical discipline and mental focus. Oddly enough, the tiniest lapse, a misaligned letter or blot of ink, can feel monumental in this environment. Sunlight slants across the desks, illuminating tiny details. The faint smudges on an otherwise pristine page, the way the quill glints briefly as it catches light, the slight curl at the edge of parchment. You notice a curious detail. One monk has a tiny charm tied to the corner of his inkpot, a small carved figure of a cat. Scholars still debate whether such personal tokens were considered superstitious, decorative, or quietly humorous, but in this space, it makes perfect sense, small touches of humanity threaded through strict routines. You drift closer to another desk, where a young monk is laboriously copying a religious manuscript. The letters flow in perfect symmetry, yet there's a subtle individuality in each curve. You realize that no two manuscripts are truly identical, a reminder that human hands, and not machines, shape the flow of knowledge. Oddly, you also notice a tiny doodle in the margin, a small stick figure performing some unknown ritual. It's probably a monk's secret joke, scribbled centuries ago, a whisper from the past that someone, somewhere, had a sense of humor even in rigorous devotion. You wander further down the room, letting your eyes take in the soft glow of candlelight supplementing the sun's rays. The scriptorium hums with quiet energy. The scratch of quills, the occasional soft sigh, the rustle of robes as monks shift their positions. You notice a faint shimmer along the floorboards where sunlight hits dust motes, creating the illusion of a miniature galaxy. Scholars still argue whether the architecture of scriptoriums intentionally maximized natural light for productivity or was purely a practical consideration. In this moment, you're content to simply marvel at the interplay of light and purpose. A faint draft drifts through the room, lifting the edges of parchment as if it wants to join the work. You watch it settle on a partially inked page, curling slightly before a monk presses it flat again. The attention to detail here is painstaking, and yet there's an almost meditative quality to it. You feel your own breathing slow as you watch the rhythm of careful hands, the deliberate formation of letters, the quiet dedication to a craft that stretches across centuries. Oddly, the act seems both timeless and intimate, a bridge connecting you to lives long past. You notice one monk with unusually large glasses perched precariously on his nose, his eyes scanning each letter with extreme care. Oddly, he seems unaware of everything else in the room, completely absorbed in the tiny universe of text in front of him. Scholars still debate whether such focused study improved the accuracy of copied manuscripts or merely served as spiritual discipline. You can't help but admire the intensity of concentration, the way even the smallest lapse could ripple through a document that might last for centuries. Nearby, a monk dips his quill into ink, holding it with a delicate precision. A tiny droplet threatens to fall, but he pauses, adjusting the angle, then continues writing without incident. You notice a faint, almost imperceptible sound, the quill scraping lightly against parchment, a sound so subtle that it could be mistaken for silence. Yet here, it resonates, a reminder that even in quietude, the smallest action carries significance. Oddly, the combination of silence and small sounds makes the room feel alive, as though the manuscripts themselves are breathing. Sunlight shifts as the morning advances, revealing more subtle details. Tiny scratches on the desks from years of diligent work, faint ink stains that never fully washed away, the soft curves of letters that seem almost sculptural. A curious addition catches your eye, a miniature marginal illustration of a monk riding a snail. Scholars still debate whether such whimsical drawings were a form of meditation, humor, or covert social commentary, but in the moment, it makes you chuckle softly. These little eccentricities make the scriptorium feel human, breathing, imperfectly perfect. You notice the faint scent of beeswax from the candles mixed with the metallic tang of ink. You inhale deeply, letting it fill your senses. Your fingers trace a smooth patch of wood on a desk, worn by countless generations. Oddly, the tactile experience connects you to the past in a way words cannot. The same grooves you feel were likely touched by hands centuries older than you. You sense a silent continuity, an unbroken line from monk to monk, each contributing to a world shaped by patience and devotion. A sudden, almost imperceptible noise breaks the rhythm, a tiny knock on a wooden windowpane. You glance toward it, seeing a small bird perched outside, seemingly watching the monk's work. Oddly, it adds a sense of presence, a reminder that life outside continues, observing quietly, unnoticed by most but threading subtly into the fabric of this secluded world. Scholars still debate whether such interactions with the natural world influenced monastic creativity, but for you, it is an undeniable connection. Your eyes drift to a shelf of completed manuscripts stacked carefully, their spines worn, pages golden with age. The variety of texts, from theological treatises to practical guides on gardening or medicine, reminds you of the breadth of knowledge preserved here. You pause to imagine the hands that crafted each letter, the care taken to ensure accuracy, the lives dedicated to repetition and focus. The thought is humbling, almost hypnotic, pulling you deeper into a meditative state where time seems irrelevant. A faint sound of laughter reaches your ears from a distant corridor, probably a brief exchange between two monks. It is soft, almost imperceptible, but it reminds you that even in rigid routines, joy finds a way to manifest. You smile at the thought. Centuries-old humanity, captured in scribbles, whispers, and tiny, fleeting moments. Oddly, this balance between discipline and humor feels like the heartbeat of the monastery itself, steady and patient. You wander toward the far end of the room, noticing the soft, rhythmic movement of a monk polishing a desk. Tiny flecks of dust lift into the sunlight, creating a subtle shimmer. You pause to watch, fascinated by the combination of motion, light, and texture. Scholars still argue whether monastic labor was primarily spiritual practice or practical necessity, but the answer seems irrelevant as you simply absorb the rhythm, letting it lull your thoughts into a calm, almost dreamlike state. The scriptorium hums quietly around you, each sound precise yet understated. The scratch of quill, the shuffle of parchment, the faint swish of robes. A small draft lifts a sheet slightly, and a monk presses it gently, as if correcting not only the page but the flow of time itself. You realize that in this careful, deliberate environment, every movement carries weight. Oddly, it feels less like labor and more like choreography, a dance of devotion, patience, and human presence. By the time you step back toward the doorway, sunlight has moved further across the desks, highlighting the intricate details of handwriting, the uneven edges of parchment, and the subtle imperfections that make each manuscript unique. You breathe in deeply, carrying the scent, sound, and rhythm of the scriptorium with you. Scholars still debate the significance of these spaces in shaping knowledge and culture, but right now, the importance is personal. You have glimpsed the beauty of deliberate focus, human curiosity, and centuries-old artistry. As you leave, you feel a subtle sense of reverence, not just for the texts, but for the people who created them. The quiet, precise movements, the faint eccentricities, the interplay of light, sound, and smell, all form a tapestry that envelops you, slows your thoughts, and encourages presence. Even the smallest details, the tiny doodle, the flicker of candlelight, the scratch of a quill, carry weight in this suspended world, each moment a thread in a centuries-long pattern of life, learning, and devotion. You drift toward the refectory, the scent of simple food drifting faintly through the corridor. The room is long and austere, wooden benches stretching along stone tables that have felt the weight of countless meals over centuries. The walls are plain, save for a few worn tapestries depicting biblical scenes, their colors muted with age. Scholars still debate whether the austere decor encouraged reflection or simply reflected a lack of resources, but right now, it feels calming, almost meditative. You step inside and pause, letting your senses adjust. The air is cooler here, with a faint hint of smoke from a distant hearth. Tiny motes of dust float lazily in the shafts of morning light. A monk walks past carrying a wooden tray, the quiet scrape of its weight on the floor echoing softly. Oddly, he hums a barely audible tune, a personal rhythm that contrasts with the general silence yet feels entirely natural. You smile at the small rebellion of sound in this otherwise controlled environment. The tables are meticulously arranged, each place set with a wooden plate and a simple cup. You notice the repetition, the symmetry. It is almost comforting, a signal that order governs even the smallest details. Oddly, the plates show tiny chips from centuries of use, each imperfection a testament to the lives that have passed through here. Scholars still argue whether the placement of utensils and plates had symbolic significance or was purely practical, but the subtle uniformity makes you pause and appreciate the quiet discipline of communal life. As you walk along the tables, your fingers brushing the cool wood, you notice a small detail. One table has faint scratch marks along the edge, probably from a novice sharpening a knife or practicing their initials long ago. You imagine the small frustrations, the playful moments, and the minor rebellions that must have peppered centuries of meals. The human presence is tangible here, subtle but persistent, threading its way through the austere environment. The monks begin to gather for their morning meal. They enter quietly, robes brushing against the stone floor, eyes cast down. Each moves with a deliberate grace, a ritual of entry that feels both precise and timeless. You watch as they arrange themselves, noticing the subtle hierarchy in seating, the senior monks in one section, the novices at the far end. Oddly, the arrangement doesn't feel rigid. It is a structure, yes, but one that has developed organically over time. Scholars still debate whether such seating arrangements reflected rank, spiritual merit, or practical convenience. A faint murmur of whispered conversation rises as the monks settle. It is almost imperceptible, blending seamlessly with the subtle ambient sounds of the room, the scrape of benches, the rustle of robes, the faint creak of doors. You notice a small quirk. A monk sneaks a tiny bit of bread from his neighbor's plate when no one is looking. Oddly humorous, it humanizes the solemnity of the moment, a reminder that even in strict routines, small acts of individuality persist. You find a quiet spot near the center of the room and sit, letting the rhythm of communal life wash over you. The morning meal is simple: a thin slice of bread, a small bowl of porridge, and a cup of weak ale or water. You notice the textures, the faint aroma of grain, the slight roughness of wooden utensils. Oddly, the simplicity is luxurious in its own way. It forces attention on the experience of eating rather than the indulgence of taste. Scholars still debate whether fasting and minimalism enhanced spiritual focus or merely reinforced discipline, but you find the effect is undeniably calming. The monks begin a brief period of silent prayer before eating. Heads bow, hands fold, and the air seems to pulse with intention. You feel the subtle shift in energy, the room vibrating with quiet concentration. One monk lets out a barely audible sigh as he lifts his spoon, oddly human, oddly relatable. You take a slow breath, letting the serenity sink in, your body matching the deliberate pace of the ritual. As the meal begins, you notice the way they eat, slowly, mindfully, without conversation. Each bite is deliberate, each swallow measured. Oddly, the simplicity of the meal makes the act of eating almost meditative, the rhythm of chewing and swallowing synchronizing with the subtle ambient sounds of the refectory. You notice one monk occasionally tracing patterns on his plate with his spoon, small, absent-minded doodles that seem to bridge devotion and whimsy. Scholars still debate whether such fidgeting was distraction, meditation, or hidden communication, but you simply watch, fascinated. The sunlight shifts across the room, illuminating small details. The grains of wood in the tables, the faint carvings along the bench edges, the subtle textures of robes as they catch the light. You notice a tiny ant wandering across a tabletop, undeterred by the human presence. Oddly, it seems like a silent observer, a living witness to centuries of ritualized meals. You wonder how many generations of ants have traced these same surfaces. A faint draft lifts a corner of a monk's robe, revealing a small, worn charm tied to his belt. You notice it because it catches the light, a subtle glimmer among the muted tones of the room. Oddly, the charm feels significant, a tiny artifact of individuality in a highly regimented environment. Scholars still argue whether monks used charms for protection, luck, or personal meaning, but its presence sparks your imagination. You think about the human need to leave little signatures, small traces, even in the most disciplined settings. You follow the monks' movements carefully, noting the synchronization of action, lifting cups, passing bowls, nodding subtly to one another. There's an elegance to the simplicity, a rhythm that feels like it belongs as much to the architecture of the space as to the people themselves. Oddly, the simplicity. You find yourself moving toward the refectory, where austere simplicity meets quiet routine. The room is long, wooden beams overhead, walls bare except for the faintest traces of soot and age. A chill lingers in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of porridge and stale bread. Scholars still argue whether the austere monastic diet was more about spiritual discipline or practical limitations, but as you step inside, the reasoning feels secondary. The sensory reality of this place is enough to capture your attention. You slide into a bench at one end, noticing the rows of simple wooden tables and benches, worn smooth by centuries of use. Your bare feet press against the cool stone floor, and you realize that even the act of walking quietly across this space is a small exercise in mindfulness. The sound of shuffling robes, the scrape of wooden benches, and the occasional clink of a utensil forms a soft symphony that is both grounding and hypnotic. You probably won't survive a modern buffet after this, but for now, the simplicity feels almost indulgent. The monks sit in careful order, forming silent lines. Each carries a small wooden bowl, likely filled with a thin broth or porridge, and a loaf of coarse bread. You notice a peculiar detail. One monk has a tiny feather tucked into the rim of his bowl, perhaps a lucky charm or an old habit. Scholars still debate whether minor personal flourishes like this were tolerated or subtly frowned upon, but here, it feels like a small, human wink amid strict discipline. You take a seat, letting your eyes drift over the room. Candles flicker softly in the early morning light, casting long shadows on the walls and benches. The room hums with muted activity, gentle murmurs as food is served, the scrape of wooden ladles against bowls, the faint clatter of utensils. You notice the smallest sounds. A tiny drop of broth hitting the stone floor, a whispered cough, the faint rustle of a robe as a monk shifts position. Oddly, these minor noises make the space feel alive rather than oppressive, a subtle pulse under the veneer of order. The first meal begins with a brief prayer, each monk inclining his head, murmuring inaudibly. You join in silently, feeling the rhythm of repetition, the centuries of voices that have echoed in this same space. The words are simple, almost unnoticeable, yet they carry the weight of ritual, of tradition, of deliberate mindfulness. Scholars still debate whether such meals were more about physical nourishment or spiritual formation, but in this quiet, rhythmic motion, the distinction blurs. You reach for your bowl, noting the simple texture of porridge. It is warm and unremarkable, yet the flavor is oddly grounding. You chew slowly, savoring each bite in a deliberate manner that modern life rarely allows. You glance at the monks around you. Some eat in near silence, others let small sighs or murmurs slip, tiny human imperfections threading through rigid practice. Oddly, it makes you feel connected, part of a rhythm larger than yourself, suspended in both time and attention. The room has a peculiar stillness, punctuated only by movement and occasional sound. A tiny droplet of water slides from a rim of a wooden cup, landing softly on the stone floor. You notice a faint scratch in the table, probably centuries old, perhaps made by a bored novice with a quill. Scholars still debate whether such marks were accidental or intentional expressions of individuality, yet here, it seems to serve as a whisper from history, a subtle human signature beneath the weight of ritual. The monks eat with remarkable attention, each bite deliberate, each swallow measured. The simple meal, though monotonous by modern standards, carries a strange elegance. You notice the warmth radiating from the wooden benches, the faint creak of joints in the old wood, the way the candlelight catches the rough surface of bowls and spoons. Oddly, this attention to detail, the texture, the light, the rhythm of small acts, feels luxurious, despite the sparseness of the setting. You glance at a monk across the table, whose thin hands hold a wooden spoon with precise care. A tiny piece of bread falls, and he doesn't react immediately, letting it settle on the table before moving it carefully back to his plate. Scholars still argue whether such meticulousness was purely about discipline or an expression of respect for sustenance itself. In your mind, it doesn't matter, the act is mesmerizing, a small meditation in motion. Between bites, you notice subtle conversations conveyed through glance and gesture, a nod here, a slight tilt of the head there. The language is minimal, yet it carries meaning, connecting the monks without breaking the silence. Oddly, the economy of communication makes each gesture more meaningful, more deliberate, more human. You start to appreciate the nuanced dance of silence and sound, attention and action. The meal continues, slow and deliberate. You feel yourself adjusting to the pace, your own motions lengthening, your thoughts stretching in time with the monks. The simple act of eating becomes a meditative exercise. Chew, swallow, breathe, observe. You notice the smell of bread, the warmth of the porridge, the slight tang of iron from the stone floor, all combining into a sensory meditation that soothes the mind. Scholars still debate whether this austere simplicity fostered discipline or enhanced spiritual reflection, but here, both seem entwined naturally. A small detail catches your attention. One monk, perhaps younger, occasionally taps his spoon against the edge of his bowl, softly enough not to break the rhythm of the room. Oddly, the tiny variation adds texture to the morning's soundscape, a human note in an otherwise steady hum. You smile, realizing that imperfection and variation are part of the beauty, the continuity, the life of this space. As the meal winds down, you notice the monks' movements becoming even more deliberate. Bowls are placed carefully on the wooden tables, crumbs swept up with a practiced hand, and silence resumes, heavier now with the weight of completion. The air feels warmer, infused with faint aromas of food, wax, and human presence. You feel an intimate connection to this simple, austere routine, a rhythm repeated for centuries, each repetition both ordinary and sacred. By the time the meal concludes, you feel subtly altered. Your senses are sharper, your mind calmer, your awareness expanded by attention to simple details. The austere breakfast, though lacking in flavor and variety, has nourished more than your stomach, it has fed your patience, observation, and presence. You realize that the quiet discipline of the refectory is a kind of gentle training, for your mind, for your body, for your perception. Oddly, the simplicity feels luxurious, like an indulgence for attention rather than appetite. You rise from the bench, letting the chill of the stone floor return to your bare feet. The room, though emptying, carries the echo of ritual, a subtle residue of sound and movement that lingers in the air. You step lightly, aware that you are part of a centuries-long sequence of breakfasts, each one following the same rhythm, each one unique in the presence of the people living it. Scholars still argue whether the monks themselves were fully conscious of the meditative qualities of their meals, but in your experience, it is undeniable. Before leaving, you glance back at the room. The rows of benches, the worn tables, the faint traces of incense and porridge, the subtle patterns of light and shadow. You notice the tiniest details, a small scratch on the floor, a leftover crumb, a streak of sunlight across the wall, and realize that each contributes to the quiet tapestry of life here. Oddly, these small, overlooked things feel monumental in their ability to connect you to centuries of human presence, devotion, and patience. You step into the cloister again, feeling the sun beginning to climb higher, casting longer shadows along the stone pathways. Your senses are alert, your mind calm, your body subtly attuned to the rhythm of monastic life. The austere breakfast has become a meditation, a gentle bridge between the dreamlike stillness of the early morning and the purposeful labor awaiting later. You carry with you the sensory memory, the warmth, the aroma, the tactile sensation of simple objects handled with care. And as you walk toward the garden, the refectory behind you, the echoes of the meal linger softly, a gentle reminder that simplicity can carry profound meaning. Even in a world stripped of modern indulgences, you sense richness, not in flavor, but in rhythm, attention, and human presence. The austere breakfast, in its quiet, deliberate manner, has already begun shaping your day, guiding your awareness to the subtle details, the slow rhythms, and the unexpected beauty in ordinary acts. You wander into the monastery's garden, where the air is crisp, and the scent of earth and herbs wraps around you like a gentle cloak. The morning sun glances off dew-laden leaves, creating a scattered pattern of light that dances across the stone paths. Scholars still argue whether monastic gardens were primarily practical, providing herbs and vegetables, or symbolic, representing paradise on earth. You decide it doesn't matter, the garden is both. You inhale deeply, letting the aroma of rosemary, sage, and thyme fill your lungs, each scent mingling with the faint warmth of sunlit soil. You wander past rows of meticulously maintained herbs and vegetables. The monks move slowly, deliberately, tending to their plants with careful hands. One monk trims the edges of a lavender bush with precise snips, the soft, snip snip, barely audible over the faint rustle of leaves. Oddly, a tiny snail crawls along the garden path, leaving a glistening trail behind it. Scholars still debate whether small creatures like this were seen as harmless companions, pests, or subtle symbols of patience. You watch it, fascinated by its slow, deliberate progress, feeling strangely aligned with its pace. The garden is divided into neat sections, each designated for specific purposes. Some plots grow medicinal herbs, their aroma sharp and medicinal, others are dedicated to vegetables like cabbages and onions, earthy and grounding. Tiny flowers peek out along the edges, a whimsical contrast to the rigid rows. You pause at one of the flower beds, noticing a small carved stone tucked beneath a lavender bush. The carving depicts a tiny monk, hunched over a plant, eyes closed in concentration. Oddly, it feels like a silent companion, a reminder that devotion can take many forms, even in miniature sculpture. You step carefully over a narrow stone path, feeling the cold beneath your feet. The garden hums with life. Bees buzz lazily from plant to plant, birds flit along the hedges, and the wind carries soft whispers of leaves brushing together. Scholars still argue whether monastic gardens were intended to teach patience, encourage meditation, or simply ensure practical sustenance. You smile at the thought that the answer might be all of the above. After all, the garden seems to teach without words, its lessons embedded in rhythm, observation, and touch. You approach a small fountain at the garden's center. Water trickles gently from a stone spout into a shallow basin, forming soft ripples that catch the sunlight. The sound is subtle, hypnotic, a tiny river contained in a crafted stone. You kneel beside it, letting your hand hover above the surface, feeling the cool mist lightly on your fingertips. Oddly, a small frog leaps from one edge of the basin to another, completely unconcerned with your presence. Scholars still debate whether animals in monastic gardens were tolerated for practical reasons, spiritual symbolism, or both, but in this moment, the frog's quiet presence feels like a small act of companionship. You move along the rows of vegetables, noting the meticulous care taken in each plot. Soil is freshly turned, leaves carefully inspected, and weeds removed with precision. A young monk hums softly as he tends a patch of lettuce, a faint melody that blends seamlessly with the rustle of leaves and gentle trickle of water. Oddly, his tune reminds you of the morning chant, as if the rhythm of devotion persists beyond the chapel, following the monks into every part of their day. Scholars still argue whether such melodies were intentional training for attention or simply a pleasant side effect of repetitive labor. You pause at an aromatic patch of thyme, inhaling its pungent scent. The tiny leaves release a warmth as you gently brush them between your fingers. You notice the irregularities, the slightly curled edges, a faint discoloration, a tiny bite taken by an unseen insect. Oddly, the imperfections make the plants feel alive, reminding you that beauty exists in subtle flaws, not only in perfect symmetry. Scholars still debate whether monastic attention to detail was practical or symbolic, but right now, the balance of order and imperfection is hypnotic. The paths wind gently, creating a small labyrinth of greenery. You follow one that leads toward the orchard, where small fruit trees stretch their branches toward the sun. Apples, pears, and cherries hang low, some ripe, some still clinging to the promise of maturity. You pluck a small apple, feeling its smooth skin and slight weight in your hand. Oddly, it feels like holding centuries of care, sunlight, and water all in one small, round object. Scholars still argue whether orchards were primarily utilitarian or symbolic, but in this moment, the question is irrelevant. It is enough that the fruit exists, and you are here to witness it. A small wooden bench sits in the shade of an apple tree. You pause, letting your fingers trace the grain of the weathered wood. Tiny carvings, initials, small shapes, faint symbols, decorate its surface, likely etched by monks over generations. You sit, letting your bare feet sink into the cool grass, noticing the contrast of textures: stone paths, wooden benches, soft leaves beneath your fingers. Oddly, this tactile awareness slows your mind more than any meditation, grounding you in the moment. Birdsong fills the air, layered and complex. You notice the tiny flick of a sparrow's wings, the glint of sunlight on a robin's beak, and the subtle rustle of leaves disturbed by unseen insects. Oddly, these small details create a quiet symphony, a reminder that life continues in small, unnoticed rhythms alongside human labor. Scholars still debate whether the soundscape of monastic gardens was intentionally cultivated for meditation or naturally emergent, but the effect is undeniable. Your mind slows, your attention sharpens, your thoughts soften. You wander toward the herb garden again, this time noticing subtle patterns in the planting. Rows align with the sun's path, small markers indicate harvest times, and tiny stakes support young plants. Oddly, the combination of order and organic growth mirrors your own experience in the monastery so far, a balance between structure and flow. Scholars still argue whether such layouts were dictated by ritual, practicality, or both, but the harmony of purpose and improvisation feels obvious to you. A small bird lands on the edge of a fountain, pecking gently at a floating leaf. You watch its precise movements, noting the way it balances, dips, and lifts with effortless grace. Oddly, it feels like a teacher, demonstrating patience, timing, and awareness. Scholars still debate whether animals in gardens influenced monastic thinking or were incidental, but in your mind, the lesson is clear: attentiveness matters, even in the smallest gestures. The sunlight continues its slow climb, creating subtle shifts in shadow and color. Dew on the leaves catches the light, sparkling like tiny diamonds, while the orchard provides dappled shade that softens the harshness of the mid-morning sun. You wander slowly, deliberately, allowing every sound, scent, and visual detail to register. Oddly, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. A bee landing on lavender, a fallen leaf drifting along a path, a tiny snail making its patient journey across a stone. By now, you feel a subtle rhythm entering your own movements. You step with care, notice the small details, breathe in the scents, and let your attention flow with the garden's quiet pulse. Scholars still debate whether monastic gardens were primarily functional, spiritual, or aesthetic, but you realize that the answer is all of the above. The garden teaches patience, observation, and presence, guiding your senses without a single word of instruction. You pause at a small patch of wildflowers, noticing their irregular growth patterns. One bloom leans toward the sun while another curls slightly inward. Oddly, this imperfection feels intentional, as if nature itself participates in the meditation of the monastery. Scholars still argue about whether wildflower sections were tolerated or encouraged, but it hardly matters. Their presence is a subtle reminder of the beauty in chaos and order coexisting. A gentle breeze passes through the garden, lifting the edges of leaves and brushing against your bare skin. You notice the faint hum of bees, the rustle of branches, the distant clang of a bell calling monks toward their next task. Oddly, the soundscape is both active and restful, a paradox that your mind embraces without resistance. Scholars still debate whether the design of gardens intentionally incorporated auditory and olfactory cues to encourage mindfulness, but for now, you let it happen naturally. As the morning progresses, you wander toward the far corner of the garden, where a small wooden shed stores tools. The door creaks slightly as you peek inside, noticing trowels, pruning knives, and baskets neatly stacked. Oddly, the simplicity of the tools contrasts sharply with the complexity of the life they sustain. Scholars still argue whether simplicity in material culture enhanced spiritual discipline, but the immediate effect is clear. You feel a sense of calm efficiency, a connection between action and purpose. You pause one last time in the center of the garden, closing your eyes and letting the sun warm your face. The rhythm of your breath aligns with the subtle sounds around you. Water trickling, birdsong, leaves rustling, distant chanting faintly echoing from the chapel. Oddly, you realize that your awareness has expanded, not outward into endless distractions, but inward, into a slow, deliberate perception of the world. Scholars still debate the purpose of monastic gardens, but for you, the lesson is immediate. Presence is cultivated, one small, intentional act at a time. You rise, stretching your bare feet and fingers, and begin to walk back toward the cloister. The garden's lessons linger in your senses. Textures, scents, sounds, and rhythms, each forming a quiet symphony that accompanies your movements. You notice the tiny imperfections, the subtle beauty, and the deliberate order coexisting in perfect harmony. Oddly, you feel as though you are carrying the garden within you, a gentle rhythm to guide your next steps through the monastery. You step into the cloister, where stone arches frame a calm courtyard. The air is cooler here, the shadows longer, and the quiet almost tangible. Scholars still argue whether cloisters were designed primarily for meditation, exercise, or circulation, but as you wander beneath the arches, you realize their purpose is both practical and spiritual. The symmetry of the columns, the gentle curve of the arches, the way sunlight filters through openings, it all invites a quiet contemplation that feels almost automatic. Your footsteps echo softly on the worn stone, blending with distant sounds. The murmur of monks, the faint scrape of a quill from the scriptorium, the occasional rustle of robes. Oddly, each sound seems amplified in this space, drawing your attention to the subtleties of presence. You notice a faint spiral pattern etched into one of the stones, nearly worn away by centuries of passage. Scholars still debate whether such carvings were decorative, symbolic, or merely incidental, but you find yourself tracing it with your fingers, marveling at its quiet persistence. The courtyard garden within the cloister is modest but meticulously maintained. Small herb beds line the edges, interspersed with carefully placed stones and flowering plants. You wander along the stone path, feeling the cool surface beneath your bare feet, noting the way sunlight dapples across the mossy patches. Oddly, a tiny snail glides across a stone, leaving a faint, glistening trail, reminding you of the patience required in both gardening and monastic life. Scholars still debate whether small animals were intentionally preserved in cloisters as symbols of humility and mindfulness, but you silently appreciate their quiet presence. You pause to observe a small fountain at the courtyard's center. Water trickles over a carved basin, the soft sound hypnotic against the backdrop of silence. You place your hand near the surface, feeling the cool mist settle lightly on your skin. Oddly, a leaf drifts onto the water, spinning slowly before coming to rest, an unplanned addition to the garden's choreography. Scholars still argue whether the positioning of fountains had spiritual symbolism or was merely functional, but in this moment, the precise reason doesn't matter. The effect is meditative, grounding, and oddly comforting. Walking beneath the arches, you notice subtle details. The texture of stone worn smooth by centuries of touch, faint carvings of symbols that no one remembers the meaning of, the occasional patch of moss softening the harsh geometry. You pause at one arch, noticing a small inscription barely legible, a monk's name and date, etched perhaps as a memory, perhaps as a fleeting act of vanity. Oddly, it feels intimate, a human trace against the backdrop of Stoic architecture. Scholars still debate whether personal inscriptions were encouraged or quietly tolerated, but the act of discovery itself brings a small thrill of connection. You wander to the edge of the cloister where benches line the walls. Sitting down, you let your feet rest on the cold stone and lean back, taking in the rhythm of the space. The arches create a visual symmetry that draws your gaze upward, toward the sky framed by stone. Oddly, the pattern of light and shadow resembles a slow-moving tapestry, each shift in the sun's position subtly changing the scene. Scholars still argue whether cloisters were designed with astronomical or purely aesthetic intentions, but the interplay of light feels purposeful, deliberate, and quietly mesmerizing. A faint breeze enters through one of the open arches, lifting loose strands of your hair and rustling the leaves of small plants along the walls. You notice the tiniest details. A small bird hopping along the ledge, a fallen petal spinning lazily on the wind, a shadow stretching across the floor in delicate lines. Oddly, these minute observations feel as important as the grand architectural gestures, teaching you that presence often lies in small, overlooked moments. Scholars still debate whether monastic architecture intentionally guided the observer toward mindfulness, but your mind quietly absorbs the lesson. You wander toward a corner where sunlight illuminates a patch of moss-covered stone. The green surface seems almost velvety beneath your fingers. You kneel, feeling the texture, the dampness, the subtle life growing in hidden spaces. Oddly, it reminds you of the careful attention monks gave to their manuscripts and gardens alike, a slow, deliberate cultivation of both life and order. Scholars still argue whether such minor attention to detail was spiritual training or simply habit, but in this moment, the distinction feels unimportant. Walking along the perimeter, you notice a small niche in the wall containing a carved relief. The figure is worn, its details softened by centuries, but you can make out a robed monk holding a scroll. Oddly, the relief almost seems to watch you as you move past, a quiet companion in this enclosed world. Scholars still debate the didactic purpose of such reliefs, whether they instructed, inspired, or merely decorated, but you feel the subtle encouragement to slow down, observe, and reflect. You pause at a bench facing the courtyard fountain. Sitting, you close your eyes and let the ambient sounds wash over you. The trickle of water, the distant murmur of monks, the soft hiss of leaves stirred by a passing breeze. Oddly, the absence of structured sound makes your mind more receptive to subtle rhythms, the tiny variations, the unexpected flutters, the quiet movements you might otherwise miss. Scholars still argue whether silence in cloisters was a tool of discipline or naturally emergent from design, but you feel its effects instantly, as a gentle mental clearing. A sudden chirp catches your attention, a tiny sparrow darting along the archways, its movement precise yet erratic. Oddly, its presence feels deliberate, a small punctuation in the cloister's otherwise steady rhythm. Scholars still debate whether animals were symbols of humility or incidental visitors, but you appreciate the interruption, the reminder that life continues independently, even in a world defined by routine. You wander along the shaded paths, tracing the worn stone with your fingers. Each indent, each smooth patch, tells a story of countless bare feet passing by. Oddly, you feel a connection not only to the monks but to the unrecorded histories of those who have simply walked these stones. Scholars still argue whether cloisters were primarily intended for reflection or functional passage, but for you, each step is a meditation, a deliberate engagement with history and space. You approach a small wooden door at the end of one archway, curious about what lies beyond. Peeking through, you glimpse a tiny library nook, shelves of old manuscripts stacked carefully. Oddly, it feels like a secret pocket of knowledge, a hidden echo of the scriptorium you visited earlier. Scholars still debate whether such alcoves were for private study or practical storage, but the allure of discovery feels immediate and personal. You move along the courtyard's edge, noticing the interplay of light across the stone floor. Shadows lengthen, cross paths, and shift as the sun climbs higher. Oddly, the floor itself seems like a canvas, each step you take altering the pattern momentarily before it changes again. Scholars still debate the aesthetic intentions of monastic floors and surfaces, but your attention is fully captured by the ephemeral artistry of shadows and sun. You pause once more beneath the arches, inhaling the subtle mixture of stone, moss, and sun-warmed air. Oddly, the texture of the moment, the smell, the temperature, the soundscape, the filtered sunlight, feels almost sacred, a sensory reminder of presence. Scholars still argue whether cloisters were spiritual tools or practical architecture, but in this suspended moment, you need no answer. Finally, you wander toward the exit of the cloister, feeling the slow rhythm of your breath align with the subtle pulses around you. Water trickling, birds flitting, leaves rustling, stone settling. Oddly, you carry a sense of quiet discipline and mindful observation, a gentle layering of sensory awareness cultivated over hours of wandering. Scholars may debate, but your experience confirms the cloister's purpose in the simplest, most intimate way. It teaches patience, observation, and presence, without a single spoken word. You step out into the sunlit monastery courtyard beyond, the lessons of the cloister lingering in your senses. The arches, shadows, textures, and subtle life around you form a quiet symphony that follows you, a gentle accompaniment to your next steps. Oddly, you feel lighter, more aware, and subtly aligned with a rhythm that has endured for centuries, embedded in stone, water, and living beings alike. You follow a narrow stone path leading toward the scriptorium, where the morning light streams through tall, narrow windows, painting the room with golden rectangles. The scent of aged parchment and ink is subtle but unmistakable, filling your senses in a way that feels almost intoxicating. Scholars still debate whether scriptoriums were primarily functional, designed for copying texts, or intended as meditative spaces to reinforce discipline. You don't need an answer yet. Just breathing in the warm, slightly musty air is enough to slow your mind. You enter quietly, noticing the long wooden tables and benches arranged with careful precision. Each table holds parchment, ink pots, quills, and knives for scraping mistakes. Oddly, one table has a tiny carved rabbit near the edge, perhaps left by a previous monk with a sense of humor or a fleeting moment of whimsy. Scholars still argue whether small carvings like this were tolerated or subtly discouraged, but it feels like a secret companion, a small act of personality hidden in austere surroundings. The monks at work are absorbed in their tasks, quills moving in steady rhythm across parchment. You watch their meticulous attention to detail, the way hands hover, dip into ink, and glide over the page. Oddly, a small fly lands on one manuscript, and the monk doesn't flinch. Scholars still debate whether insects were considered distractions, omens, or neutral presences in the scriptorium, but the subtle coexistence of life and labor feels intentional. You wander past a shelf stacked with completed manuscripts. The edges of the vellum are smooth, some illuminated with tiny gold flourishes, others bearing intricate marginalia, small drawings of animals, fantastical creatures, or sometimes playful caricatures of monks themselves. Oddly, a tiny cat doodled in the corner of one page seems to peek at you, its whiskers drawn with exquisite care. Scholars still argue whether such marginalia were instructional, entertainment, or coded messages, but you find it amusing, a wink across the centuries. A faint draft brushes against your face, carrying with it the soft rustle of parchment. You notice the subtle smell of ink, metallic and earthy, mingling with faint wood odors from the tables. Oddly, the sensory layering seems to sharpen your attention, making each movement, sound, and texture feel more pronounced. Scholars still debate whether multisensory engagement was intentional in monastic workspaces, but right now, it feels natural, even necessary. You pause at a table where a monk is working on an illuminated manuscript. Tiny details emerge under your careful observation. Gold leaf applied with painstaking patience, letters shaped with deliberate curves, small flourishes at the edges that seem almost whimsical. Oddly, the precision of their work doesn't feel oppressive. It feels like an act of devotion, patience, and subtle artistry. Scholars still argue whether illumination was devotional, decorative, or instructional, but you realize it is all three simultaneously. You notice a small stool tucked beneath a table, worn smooth by repeated use. Oddly, the indentations in the wood seem to map the rhythm of countless hours spent hunched over parchment. Scholars still debate whether physical discomfort was a form of training or simply an unavoidable consequence of meticulous labor, but you sense that enduring it contributes to a certain patience, a rhythm ingrained in both body and mind. The light shifts subtly through the windows, moving across the manuscripts and benches. Shadows stretch and shorten, tracing delicate patterns on the floor and tables. Oddly, these temporal changes create a living artwork, one that interacts with the monks' movements, the dust in the air, and the slight flicker of candlelight that someone left burning in the corner. Scholars still argue whether window placement and light were designed for function or symbolism, but you feel the effect immediately. It slows you, focuses you, pulls your attention into the present. A curious detail catches your eye. A small scrap of parchment pinned to a board, filled with messy doodles and notes in different handwritings. Oddly, it feels like a tiny window into lives past. Quick thoughts, playful sketches, reminders, or mistakes preserved by the mundane act of pinning. Scholars still debate whether such scraps were educational tools or merely discarded detritus, but for you, they are a charming, humanizing glimpse into centuries-old routines. You wander toward a small wooden chest in the corner, peeking inside. It contains inkpots, a few quills, and a knife with a handle worn smooth. Oddly, it seems like a miniature universe of tools that have seen countless repetitions of the same gestures. Scholars still argue whether monastic tools were designed for durability or symbolism, but the immediate impression is of continuity, the same actions, repeated generation after generation, each one quietly significant. A monk leans back briefly, stretching his shoulders, and you notice the subtle rhythm of his breathing, slow and measured. Oddly, it mirrors the movement of your own chest, a gentle synchronization you hadn't expected. Scholars still debate whether the physical movements of writing influenced meditative states, but you sense a connection forming between the body, the mind, and the act of creation. The manuscripts themselves are remarkable. Some pages are blank, awaiting future work, others are crowded with text and illustrations. Oddly, the margins seem to breathe, the white space giving the eyes a place to rest. Scholars still argue whether blank spaces were intentional, symbolic, or purely functional, but in your observation, they act as subtle punctuation in the symphony of ink and parchment. You notice a faint hum as a monk dips a quill into ink, the gentle scratching of pen on vellum blending with ambient sounds, a floorboard creaking, the rustle of robes, a distant cough. Oddly, the combined effect forms a rhythmic soundtrack, subtle and repetitive, almost lulling your mind into a meditative state. Scholars still debate whether these sounds were distractions or intentional background for concentration, but right now, they are entirely calming. A particularly ornate manuscript draws your attention. Tiny gold leaves catch the light, reflecting glimmers across the page. Oddly, you imagine centuries ago, monks working by candlelight, painstakingly applying each gilded detail without error. Scholars still argue whether such illumination was purely devotional or intended to impress visitors, but the meticulous labor itself feels devotional, an intimate dialogue between human hands and the sacred text. You step closer to a manuscript with tiny marginal doodles, dragons, tiny monks, even a little snail. Oddly, these whimsical illustrations make the room feel less austere, reminding you that humor and play were not absent from monastic life. Scholars still debate whether humor in marginalia was educational, symbolic, or purely entertainment, but it softens the seriousness of the room, and you appreciate the subtle human presence. The light continues to shift, casting soft shadows across the desks, manuscripts, and the monks' faces. Oddly, the movement of light mirrors the movement of ink across parchment, a quiet echo of activity and passage of time. Scholars still debate whether natural lighting was carefully calculated or coincidental, but its effect on your senses is undeniable, soothing, and mesmerizing. You wander past a small cabinet filled with pigments. Tiny powders of red, blue, and green are arranged in little jars, each one essential for illumination. Oddly, the bright colors contrast with the otherwise muted room, like sparks of personality amid disciplined labor. Scholars still argue whether pigments were chosen for symbolic meaning or availability, but for you, the visual richness creates a layered sensory experience. Finally, you find a quiet corner where sunlight filters directly onto a single manuscript, illuminating the gold leaf and delicate illustrations. Oddly, it feels like the book itself is alive, glowing softly, inviting your attention. Scholars still debate whether individual manuscripts were treated as sacred objects in daily use or purely as tools, but in this moment, it doesn't matter. The manuscript seems to speak across time, connecting you with the patience, skill, and dedication of monks who labored here centuries ago. As you rise to leave, you carry the quiet rhythm of the scriptorium within you, The scratch of quills, the smell of parchment, the warmth of sunlight on gold leaf, and the soft, human traces left in margins and carvings. Oddly, it feels like you are walking out not just with memories but with a gentle shift in your awareness, a slower, more attentive perception that will follow you into the rest of the monastery. You leave the scriptorium and wander toward the refectory, the smell of freshly baked bread and herbs reaching your nose even before the space comes fully into view. Scholars still argue whether refectories were designed primarily for sustenance, ritual, or a combination of both, but you don't question it yet. You simply inhale, letting the aroma anchor you in the present. The large wooden doors creak softly as you push them open, revealing rows of long benches and tables bathed in warm, muted light from the high windows. You step in quietly, noting the monks already seated, moving with deliberate care as they arrange bowls, spoons, and loaves. Oddly, a small sparrow lands near the edge of a table, unafraid of the human activity. Scholars still debate whether small animals in refectories were considered acceptable companions or a minor inconvenience, but you find its presence charming, a tiny punctuation in the rhythm of daily life. The refectory is structured for quiet efficiency. Monks sit side by side, hands folded until grace is said, voices low, movements synchronized. Oddly, you notice the subtle ways in which each monk adjusts their posture, balancing reverence with comfort, a minor choreography that has been repeated countless times. Scholars still argue whether these rituals were primarily devotional, disciplinary, or habit, but you sense that the answer is layered. All three exist simultaneously. You wander along the edge, letting your gaze take in the details. Wooden tables are polished smooth by centuries of use, bowls are simple but functional, and small clay jars hold water and wine. Oddly, one table bears faint carvings of initials and small symbols, reminders of monks long gone, each mark a subtle echo of human presence and continuity. Scholars still debate whether such carvings were tolerated or quietly encouraged, but for you, they feel like whispers across time. You pause near the head of the refectory, noticing a long, slightly raised table where the abbot would sit. The polished wood gleams under the sun streaming through the windows. Oddly, a tiny patch of moss has grown at the base of one leg, stubbornly persistent despite the order and routine surrounding it. Scholars still argue whether minor imperfections in sacred spaces were accidental or meaningful, but in this moment, it feels like a gentle reminder that nature coexists with human order. You take a slow walk along the benches, observing subtle rituals. Monks dip spoons into communal bowls, lift bread deliberately, and sip from simple cups in synchrony. Oddly, one monk absent-mindedly taps his spoon against the edge of a bowl, creating a faint, irregular rhythm that contrasts with the quiet harmony of the room. Scholars still debate whether such micro-deviations were noticed or overlooked, but you find it reassuring, an acknowledgement that even disciplined life allows small moments of spontaneity. The refectory is not silent, but its sound is gentle and structured. You notice the subtle scrape of wood against stone floors, the soft clink of spoons, the occasional sigh or whisper, and the quiet hum of collective breathing. Oddly, the combination of sounds forms a hypnotic background, a rhythmic auditory tapestry that encourages presence and calm. Scholars still argue whether such acoustics were intentional or incidental, but their effect is undeniable. Your mind slows, attuned to the layers of subtle noise. You pause near a window, noticing sunlight spilling onto the long table. The shadows of monks stretch across the polished wood, shifting with each passing moment. Oddly, the interplay of light and shadow creates an almost living pattern, dancing across bowls, cups, and folded hands. Scholars still debate whether light placement was symbolic or purely functional, but in this space, it seems to add a meditative depth to the meal itself. You glance at the walls, adorned with small crosses and modest carvings. Oddly, a faint spiderweb clings to a corner, almost invisible until the light catches it. Scholars still argue whether such minor details were ignored, tolerated, or symbolically meaningful, but for you, it is a reminder that life continues, small and unnoticed, even in spaces devoted to ritual and discipline. You move along a table where a few monks are quietly conversing, voices low and measured. Oddly, one of them gestures subtly with a hand, tracing an invisible pattern above the bread bowl as if performing a silent ritual. Scholars still debate whether such gestures were symbolic, functional, or habitual, but the subtle choreography adds another layer of rhythm to the room. You notice the smell of herbs carried in the air: thyme, rosemary, perhaps a hint of parsley, mingling with the warmth of baked bread. Oddly, it seems almost intentional, like the scents themselves form part of the sensory meditation, grounding everyone in the present moment. Scholars still argue whether aromas in monastic spaces were engineered or incidental, but your senses absorb the combination effortlessly. Walking along the benches, you observe minor imperfections: a bowl chipped at the edge, a faint scratch on a wooden table, a candle that burns unevenly. Oddly, these tiny flaws humanize the otherwise ordered space, a quiet reminder that imperfection is woven into every act of discipline. Scholars still debate whether minor imperfections were tolerated for practical reasons or symbolic lessons, but the effect is subtle and calming. You pause near the central aisle, watching the monks' collective movements. The grace they recite, the synchronized lifting of cups, the slow breaking of bread, it all forms a continuous, quiet rhythm. Oddly, you notice that your own breathing begins to align with the flow around you, a slow, gentle attunement to the room's pulse. Scholars still argue whether ritualized eating trains attention, patience, or obedience, but in your observation, it is clearly all three simultaneously. A small bowl of fruit catches your attention. Tiny apples and pears are carefully arranged, their skins smooth and glistening. Oddly, one apple has a tiny bite missing, perhaps a previous snack left behind, an unplanned imperfection in an otherwise orderly display. Scholars still debate whether such minor deviations were meaningful, symbolic, or purely accidental, but it provides a charming, human touch to the ritual. You wander past the serving area where fresh bread is laid out. The aroma is irresistible, warm and yeasty, blending with the faint scent of herbs. Oddly, a crumb slides off a loaf and lands perfectly on the stone floor, as if marking a tiny moment of playful randomness. Scholars still argue whether small events like these were noticed or ignored in monastic life, but for you, they add an unexpected sense of life to a space devoted to order. You take a slow seat at an empty bench near the center, letting your feet rest against the stone floor. You watch sunlight play across the wooden tables, highlighting grains in the wood, small scratches, and subtle carvings. Oddly, the room seems to breathe along with you, each monk's movement and each flicker of light contributing to an intricate, living rhythm. Scholars still debate whether human observation of space was guided intentionally or emerged naturally, but you feel fully immersed, attuned to both order and subtle imperfections. A monk approaches carrying a large wooden tray of water jugs. Oddly, the gentle clink of clay against clay forms a faint percussive rhythm, blending with ambient sounds of breathing and movement. Scholars still argue whether the auditory texture of ritual spaces was incidental or deliberate, but the combined effect is meditative, grounding you in the flow of life around you. The meal begins to wind down, with bowls emptying and cups nearly drained. You notice the monks carefully aligning their utensils and bowls, an almost ritualized clearing of space. Oddly, the act itself feels calming, a tactile continuation of mindfulness. Scholars still debate whether such closing routines were primarily spiritual training or functional habit, but you sense that both purposes coexist seamlessly. Finally, you rise, leaving the refectory with the quiet hum of ritual still resonating in your senses. Oddly, the warmth of bread, the subtle sense of herbs, the rhythm of synchronized movement, and the gentle imperfections all combine to create a deep sense of calm and awareness. Scholars may debate the functional or symbolic aspects of the refectory, but you know one thing for certain: the space cultivates patience, observation, and presence, leaving a subtle imprint on the rhythm of your day in the monastery. You leave the refectory and wander toward the cloister garden, where sunlight pools across carefully tended flower beds and herbs. The soft murmur of a fountain reaches your ears, mingling with the occasional rustle of leaves. Scholars still debate whether monastic gardens were primarily functional, producing herbs and vegetables, or meditative, designed for quiet reflection. Oddly, as you step along the stone path, you realize the distinction doesn't matter. The garden feels like a sanctuary, a breathing, living companion to your senses. Your feet crunch softly on the gravel as you move between beds of thyme, sage, and lavender. The aroma is subtle but calming, a mixture of warmth, earth, and herbal sharpness that fills your lungs and slows your thoughts. Oddly, a tiny snail crawls across the path, leaving a glistening trail that seems to mark a delicate, temporal map of its passage. Scholars still argue whether gardeners tolerated such creatures intentionally or merely overlooked them, but for you, the presence of life adds a layer of quiet contemplation. You pause near a row of small flowering plants, noticing dew clinging to their petals. Oddly, a tiny bee hovers briefly, landing on one flower before darting away. Scholars still debate whether insects were symbols of diligence, humility, or simply incidental, but watching it, you feel a subtle echo of the monk's careful, rhythmic labor. The bees work without hurry, yet with focus, a quiet mirror to the pace of life in the monastery. A wooden bench sits beneath an arching trellis covered in climbing vines. You sit, letting your back rest against the warm wood, and close your eyes briefly. Oddly, the faint scratch of a bird on a nearby branch, the soft hiss of a breeze, and the distant splash of water all combine to create a natural symphony. Scholars still argue whether such environmental details were manipulated intentionally or emerged by chance, but the effect on your senses is undeniable. Your mind quiets, attuned to small movements and subtle shifts in sound. You wander toward a patch of vegetables. Small lettuces, beans climbing trellises, and carrots barely peeking above the soil. Oddly, you notice a lone radish that seems slightly larger than the others, a natural imperfection in an otherwise orderly arrangement. Scholars still debate whether such irregularities were seen as signs of divine intervention or mundane coincidence, but in this moment, it feels like a playful note in the rhythm of the garden. The gravel path leads you past a small stone fountain. Water trickles gently over carved edges, forming tiny ripples that catch the sunlight. Oddly, a single fallen leaf floats atop the ripples, circling slowly before coming to rest against the basin wall. Scholars still argue whether fountains were placed purely for aesthetic or symbolic reasons, but watching the leaf drift, you sense that the combination of motion, light, and sound is quietly meditative, intended or not. A few benches line the far edge of the garden. You wander to one and notice the texture of the wood, worn smooth by centuries of use. Oddly, tiny scratches and carvings mark past visitors' presence, initials, small symbols, even crude sketches. Scholars still debate whether such markings were encouraged, tolerated, or ignored, but to you, they are intimate traces of continuity, human echoes preserved in the garden. You pause to examine a small stone statue tucked among the herbs. A robed figure holds a book, its features softened by weather and time. Oddly, the moss creeping over the statue's base gives it a sense of gentle age, a soft cloak of nature blending stone and life. Scholars still argue whether statues were intended as instruction, inspiration, or decoration, but in this quiet corner, its presence feels reassuring and calm. A faint hum enters your awareness, the sound of bees, leaves, and water combining into a subtle rhythm. Oddly, it almost feels synchronized with your own heartbeat, a soft, meditative alignment between your body and the garden. Scholars still debate whether gardens were designed to influence perception and mood intentionally, but right now, you feel fully immersed, present in both space and time. You wander along the edge of a flower bed, noticing subtle details. Tiny petals curling inward, faint veins running across leaves, droplets of dew catching light. Oddly, a caterpillar slowly makes its way along a stem, a small, deliberate journey that mirrors the patience and care you've observed in monastic routines. Scholars still argue whether such small presences were noticed or ignored, but their quiet persistence resonates with you. You pause near a wooden trellis, tracing the vines with your fingers. Each tendril winds carefully around the wood, growing with a subtle precision that is almost architectural. Oddly, a tiny bud seems poised to bloom, a moment frozen in potential. Scholars still debate whether monastic gardeners actively guided growth symbolically or functionally, but observing this small stage of development feels quietly profound. A faint shadow crosses your path. A squirrel dashes along a low wall, disappearing behind a patch of lavender. Oddly, its movement feels purposeful, yet chaotic, a reminder that life in the garden exists independently of human schedules. Scholars still argue whether small animals were welcomed or tolerated, but the presence of spontaneous life adds a playful, unpredictable layer to the otherwise measured environment. You notice a patch of sunlight illuminating a small stone marker, worn smooth with faint inscriptions. Oddly, the letters are barely legible, yet you feel a connection to the person who carved them, a minor act of permanence in an ephemeral space. Scholars still debate whether such carvings held spiritual significance or were casual, but they feel like quiet markers of attention and presence. The path curves around to a small herb bed with fragrant rosemary and thyme. Oddly, the air seems thicker here, filled with concentrated scent that subtly fills your lungs, grounding your thoughts. Scholars still argue whether plant placement was primarily functional, symbolic, or aesthetic, but for you, the concentrated aroma acts as a sensory anchor, pulling you fully into the moment. You pause again at the fountain, noticing tiny ripples moving in slow, circular patterns. Oddly, a dragonfly lands briefly on the edge, its delicate wings catching the light. Scholars still debate whether such creatures were considered omens, symbols of patience, or purely incidental, but its presence feels serene and fleeting, a quiet punctuation in the rhythm of the garden. Walking along the outer edge, you see the subtle variations in plant height, color, and texture. Oddly, the garden is orderly yet alive with imperfection, a harmony between design and nature. Scholars still argue whether these variations were intentional or simply accepted, but to your senses, the blend of precision and irregularity is meditative, a quiet lesson in coexistence. You reach a small wooden gate at the far end of the garden, partially open. Beyond, the monastery walls rise, but here in the garden, life persists in gentle, self-contained cycles. Oddly, a single leaf drifts from a vine, spinning slowly before resting on the stone path. Scholars still debate whether observing small natural patterns was encouraged as mindfulness practice, but watching it, you feel a quiet, meditative alignment with the world around you. Finally, you pause in the center of the garden, taking a deep breath. The sunlight warms your skin, the scents of herbs and flowers mingle, the gentle sound of water and life surrounds you. Oddly, the combination of sensory inputs, visual, auditory, olfactory, creates a sense of harmony that feels larger than the sum of its parts. Scholars may debate the garden's functional or spiritual intent, but for you, it is a living meditation, a gentle, attentive space where presence and patience unfold naturally. You leave the garden and wander toward the monastery's library, a quieter, cooler space where the scent of old books and wood polish greets you immediately. Scholars still debate whether medieval libraries were primarily designed for storage, study, or status, but you don't need to decide. You just inhale deeply, letting the musky air anchor you in the moment. The light filtering through tall windows casts soft shadows across rows of shelves, highlighting the spines of carefully organized manuscripts. Your footsteps echo faintly on the stone floor as you move between shelves. Oddly, a small moted beam of sunlight illuminates a single book lying slightly askew, its cover decorated with faded gold lettering. Scholars still argue whether the organization of manuscripts was purely practical or also symbolic, but the subtle imperfection draws your attention, making you pause to appreciate the care evident in centuries of handling. You wander along the aisles, noticing the textures of the books: rough vellum, worn leather bindings, and delicate, slightly frayed pages. Oddly, a tiny insect crawls across a spine, unnoticed by the nearby monks. Scholars still debate whether insects were tolerated or considered nuisances, but its slow, deliberate movement feels oddly comforting, a reminder of the gentle persistence of life within these walls. A monk sits at a nearby table, quill in hand, copying a text with meticulous care. Oddly, the faint scratching sound of the quill forms a soft rhythm that harmonizes with distant footsteps and the rustle of turning pages. Scholars still argue whether auditory stimuli were consciously incorporated into monastic workspaces to encourage focus, but the effect is hypnotic, slowing your thoughts and sharpening your attention simultaneously. You pause at a low shelf containing manuscripts with intricate illuminations. Gold leaf glimmers faintly in the filtered light, tiny illustrations of plants, animals, and abstract patterns weaving through margins. Oddly, one page depicts a whimsical hybrid creature, half bird, half fish, peering back at you as if sharing a secret. Scholars still debate whether marginalia served educational, decorative, or symbolic purposes, but for you, it adds a layer of humor and humanity to the otherwise serene environment. The library is arranged with surprising precision. Rows of books form neat blocks, tables are spaced evenly, and every manuscript has its place. Oddly, a single chair is slightly out of alignment, almost imperceptibly. Scholars still argue whether the architecture enforced order or encouraged meditative wandering, but you notice that small deviations, like this chair, make the space feel lived in rather than sterile. You wander past a corner alcove where sunlight highlights a pile of scrolls tied neatly with string. Oddly, one scroll is unrolled slightly, revealing faint handwritten notes along the margins. Scholars still debate whether marginal notes were considered official additions, casual annotations, or private reflections, but their presence draws you closer, offering a tactile glimpse into past thoughts and decisions. A faint smell of ink and dust rises from the shelves, mingling with the subtle scent of polished wood. Oddly, it feels comforting, a sensory signature that instantly signals focus, study, and quiet reflection. Scholars still argue whether medieval libraries intentionally curated the olfactory environment, but the effect is undeniable. You feel fully present, attuned to the space and its rhythms. You notice a small lectern in the center of the room, its surface slightly slanted, worn smooth by centuries of use. Oddly, a faint scratch marks one corner, a subtle reminder of human interaction long past. Scholars still debate whether such marks were incidental or valued as traces of continuity, but for you, it forms a tactile connection to generations of monks who leaned here, reading and copying. You wander along an upper balcony, a narrow passage lined with bookshelves. The perspective allows you to see the library as a whole, a maze of shelves, tables, and small alcoves where monks work in quiet corners. Oddly, a tiny moth flits near a window, circling and disappearing into the shadowed recess. Scholars still argue whether incidental wildlife contributed to the atmosphere or was purely tolerated, but its brief, delicate presence reminds you that life, in all its small forms, continues within these walls. A monk passes nearby, carrying a stack of manuscripts. Oddly, the gentle creak of the wooden floorboards synchronizes with the faint scratching of a quill at a distant table, creating a subtle, layered rhythm. Scholars still debate whether these acoustic patterns were incidental or intentionally harmonious, but to your ears, they form a soft, calming soundtrack to your exploration. You pause at a table with an open manuscript. Tiny illustrations depict plants, stars, and marginal figures performing mundane tasks. Oddly, one figure seems to wink at you, a playful touch hidden for those who notice. Scholars still argue whether such whimsical details were tolerated, symbolic, or purely decorative, but you feel a small thrill, a connection across centuries with a monk who injected humor into his labor. The high ceilings above are adorned with simple carved beams. Oddly, the patterns of light and shadow shift as the sun moves, creating an ever-changing tapestry across tables and shelves. Scholars still debate whether architectural choices aim to inspire meditation, display hierarchy, or maximize light, but in this moment, the interplay of shadow and illumination slows your mind, drawing your attention outward and upward. You wander toward a corner where several manuscripts rest on a low shelf, their covers faded, edges slightly frayed. Oddly, one manuscript contains a curious set of diagrams resembling geometric shapes intertwined with botanical sketches. Scholars still debate whether these were educational tools, symbolic representations, or mere experiments, but the combination of natural and abstract forms intrigues you, a subtle hint of curiosity preserved in ink and parchment. A gentle draft sweeps through the open windows, carrying a mixture of outside scents, earth, stone, and faint herbs from the garden. Oddly, the breeze shifts the pages of a nearby manuscript, revealing partially obscured text. Scholars still argue whether environmental exposure affected preservation or was harnessed intentionally, but in the moment, the movement feels alive, as if the manuscripts themselves are breathing along with you. You pause near a low bench beneath a sunlit window, resting your hands on a smooth, polished surface. Oddly, tiny indentations in the wood reveal where previous monks rested their fingers, a tactile echo of centuries of attention and care. Scholars still debate whether physical traces were valued as connection or ignored, but but you feel a quiet continuity, an awareness of countless hands shaping the space over time. Walking slowly through the stacks, you notice the subtle variation in manuscript size, color, and condition. Oddly, the mismatched patterns form a visual rhythm, an accidental mosaic that adds texture to the library's order. Scholars still argue whether this diversity was intentional or circumstantial, but for your senses, it provides visual interest and gentle stimulation, complementing the quiet sounds around you. Finally, you pause in the center of the library, letting your gaze take in the entirety of the space. Sunlight, shadows, scent, sound, and texture combine into a multi-sensory meditation. Oddly, the subtle imperfections, small traces of life, and quiet rhythms form a rich, layered environment that feels simultaneously ordered and alive. Scholars may debate the intent behind every architectural choice, manuscript placement, or environmental detail, but in this moment, it doesn't matter. The library teaches patience, presence, and observation in the most tactile, immersive way possible. You leave the library and drift toward the monastery's scriptorium, the place where words, parchment, and ink converge in quiet, meticulous labor. Sunlight filters through high windows, dust motes dancing slowly in the beams, and you notice the faint scent of ink and wood mingling with the lingering aroma of herbs from the garden outside. Oddly, a small spider crawls along a windowsill, pausing momentarily before continuing its slow journey. Scholars still debate whether such tiny inhabitants were tolerated intentionally as natural pest control or simply ignored, but its careful, deliberate movement draws your attention in a meditative way. You pass rows of low tables where monks sit hunched over manuscripts, quills scratching rhythmically across parchment. Oddly, the scratching forms a hypnotic pattern, a combination of sound and motion that seems designed to slow your thoughts. Scholars still argue whether scriptoriums were acoustically designed to induce focus or whether the soundscape emerged naturally from the tasks performed, but it undeniably pulls you into a quiet, almost trance-like state. At one table, a monk is illuminating a manuscript, carefully applying gold leaf and delicate pigments. Oddly, he pauses occasionally to blow softly on the gold, ensuring it sets correctly without smudging. Scholars still debate whether such attention to minute detail was primarily devotional, aesthetic, or a combination, but observing the patient precision encourages your own mind to slow, to notice subtleties in your surroundings. You wander along the edges of the room, noting small puddles of sunlight on the worn wooden floor. Oddly, a droplet of wax from a nearby candle has pooled near the base of a chair, cooled into a fragile, glistening shape. Scholars still argue whether candle placement was carefully orchestrated to provide light or left largely to individual monks' judgment, but the small imperfections in the scriptorium add texture and life to the otherwise orderly environment. A gentle breeze flows through the open windows, causing pages to flutter softly. Oddly, one sheet of parchment bends just enough to catch the sunlight, reflecting a tiny rainbow across the table. Scholars still debate whether natural light was harnessed intentionally for both illumination and inspiration, but you find the fleeting spectrum quietly mesmerizing, a reminder of beauty and impermanence. You pause at a small corner where ink bottles are arranged in neat rows. The smell of drying ink is strong here, mingling with subtle hints of herbs from nearby storage. Oddly, one bottle appears slightly crooked, its label faded and peeling. Scholars still argue whether such slight disorder was overlooked as inconsequential or if it subtly disrupted workflow, but your mind fixates on the imperfection, allowing you to notice patterns in color, shape, and shadow. The scriptorium walls are lined with storage cabinets, each containing stacks of parchment sheets. Oddly, a tiny mouse slips between two cabinet doors, disappearing into a dark gap. Scholars still debate whether rodents were tolerated, hunted, or considered omens, but the brief, fleeting presence of the creature makes the space feel alive, unpredictable, and natural despite human order. You notice a tall monk at a distant table, working on a large codex. His quill scratches at a steady, deliberate pace, each letter forming an intricate pattern. Oddly, he pauses occasionally to hum softly, a tune barely audible but perfectly synchronized with the movements of his hands. Scholars still argue whether sound was intentionally incorporated into the act of copying manuscripts to improve concentration, but for you, the soft hum adds warmth, personality, and a subtle rhythm to the scriptorium's ambiance. Near the center of the room, a low wooden lectern holds a particularly large manuscript. Oddly, the corners of the pages have been folded repeatedly, creating soft, rounded edges. Scholars still debate whether such wear indicated frequent consultation, veneration, or mere practicality, but observing the repeated use tells you stories of past readers and their interactions with the text. A faint creak echoes as you step over a slightly uneven board in the floor. Oddly, the sound seems louder than expected, amplifying in the otherwise quiet room. Scholars still argue whether scriptoriums were designed for absolute silence or allowed occasional interruptions, but for your senses, each creak, scratch, and flutter adds texture to the experience, reminding you that human labor is never perfectly invisible. You wander toward a small alcove with shelves of pigments, crushed minerals, and powders for illumination. Oddly, a tiny bit of vermilion pigment has spilled on the edge of a shelf, leaving a vivid red smudge. Scholars still debate whether monks treated such stains as accidents, lessons in care, or opportunities for creativity, but your eyes linger on the vivid color, noticing the contrast against muted wood and parchment tones. A single candle flickers near the far window, casting long, dancing shadows across the tables. Oddly, the movement of the shadows seems synchronized with the flow of your own breathing, though you know it is only perception. Scholars still argue whether visual stimuli like candlelight were leveraged for meditation, concentration, or merely incidental, but the effect is gentle, almost hypnotic, drawing your focus inward. You pause to observe the floor itself. Oddly, tiny chips and scratches mark centuries of use, each a subtle record of countless footsteps, dropped quills, and shifted furniture. Scholars still debate whether such wear was recorded consciously as historical memory or simply accepted, but for you, the traces make the space tangible, connecting the present to generations past. Near a shelf of manuscripts in progress, you notice a small pile of unfinished pages. Oddly, one sheet has faint doodles in the margins, tiny animals, abstract patterns, and a whimsical sketch of a monk sneezing. Scholars still argue whether marginalia served as meditation, practice, humor, or mere distraction, but the playful mark gives the space a human touch, reminding you that creativity and imperfection coexist with discipline. A gentle draft from the window shifts a loose sheet of parchment, revealing faint traces of faded writing beneath the ink. Oddly, the hidden text seems like a secret waiting to be discovered, a whisper from the past. Scholars still debate whether palimpsests were intended for reuse or were simply a product of resource scarcity, but the faint words give you a sense of layered history, a dialogue across centuries. You wander slowly toward a small doorway leading to the back of the scriptorium. The air here feels slightly cooler, shaded from the sun. Oddly, a small cluster of dried herbs hangs from a beam, their subtle aroma mixing with the scent of parchment. Scholars still argue whether herbs were hung for scent, preservation, or superstition, but the faint smell is grounding, connecting the sensory experience of the room to the rhythms of daily monastic life. Finally, you pause in the middle of the scriptorium, letting your gaze travel across the tables, manuscripts, and walls. Oddly, the room seems simultaneously silent and alive. Quills scratch in rhythm, pages flutter gently, candles flicker, and dust dances in sunbeams. Scholars may debate the function, design, or symbolism of every aspect of this space, but for you, the scriptorium embodies patience, focus, and the quiet persistence of human labor, a meditative haven where time slows and observation deepens. You leave the scriptorium and follow a narrow corridor lined with stone walls, their cool surfaces slightly damp to the touch. The faint echo of your footsteps fills the passage, creating a rhythm that slows your mind. Oddly, the air carries a faint earthy scent, as if the stone itself is breathing, releasing centuries of memory into the corridor. Scholars still debate whether the architecture of monastic corridors was designed purely for structural integrity or also to foster reflection and quiet movement, but the effect on you is immediate, a subtle invitation to move slowly, deliberately, and with awareness. As you continue, you pass a small side chamber where the sound of dripping water resonates from a tiny cistern in the corner. Oddly, the droplets seem to fall in irregular intervals, creating a soft, unpredictable pattern. Scholars still argue whether natural sounds like dripping water were considered distractions or quietly encouraged as meditative aids, but you find yourself tuning in, noticing each tiny impact, each subtle variation in rhythm. You step into the monastery's infirmary, a room lined with simple wooden tables, ceramic jars, and bundles of dried herbs. The scent here is a mixture of faintly medicinal aromas and the lingering fragrance of flowers from the garden outside. Oddly, a small cat weaves between the tables, pausing to sniff at the jars before disappearing under a wooden bench. Scholars still debate whether animals were deliberately allowed in such spaces for pest control, companionship, or superstition, but for you, its presence adds life and movement to the otherwise still room. On a low table, you notice a collection of surgical tools, simple, medieval instruments for treating wounds, setting broken bones, and performing minor procedures. Oddly, one tool is slightly bent, a subtle imperfection that hints at repeated use over decades. Scholars still argue whether tool maintenance was a strict priority or a flexible practice, but observing the ware reminds you that this was a working space where care and urgency often intersected. You wander past shelves filled with jars of powders, tinctures, and dried plant matter. Oddly, a small packet of lavender has spilled, its scent mingling with the stronger aroma of more pungent herbs. Scholars still debate whether scent was deliberately used to ease suffering, mask odors, or simply as a byproduct of storage, but for you, the smell acts like a gentle balm, drawing attention to the sensory richness of the infirmary. A faint creak echoes as you step on a wooden floorboard near a low table. Oddly, the sound resonates longer than expected, amplifying slightly in the quiet room. Scholars still argue whether such acoustic effects were incidental or perhaps subconsciously valued for the rhythm they imparted, but for you, the sound slows your step, making each movement feel deliberate, almost ceremonial. You pause near a window, looking out over the monastery grounds. Oddly, a single bird lands on a distant tree branch, cocking its head as if observing you. Scholars still debate whether the placement of infirmary windows was intended to provide restorative views or simply ventilation, but the presence of life outside reminds you that the monastery exists in a living, breathing environment, not an isolated world. A wooden chest in the corner catches your eye, its surface scratched and worn. Oddly, a faint carving, a simple cross, has been etched into one corner. Scholars still argue whether such carvings were devotional acts, marks of ownership, or casual doodles, but you sense a quiet continuity, the small human trace bridging centuries. Near a shelf of books, you notice a small stack of handwritten remedies, their edges frayed, ink faded. Oddly, a tiny marginal illustration depicts a plant with a whimsical face, smiling as though offering comfort. Scholars still debate whether illustrations were meant purely for identification or carried symbolic, didactic, or playful intent, but for you, the combination of text and art feels alive, almost companionable. You wander to a corner where a basin of water rests, reflecting light from a nearby window. Oddly, a single leaf has drifted into the basin, swirling gently with faint movements of air. Scholars still argue whether such incidental reflections were noticed or imbued with meaning, but the leaf's slow dance adds a subtle, meditative rhythm, grounding you in the present moment. A faint hum drifts from another chamber, perhaps a monk chanting or softly reciting prayers. Oddly, the sound seems distant yet resonant, weaving through stone walls and echoing in unpredictable patterns. Scholars still debate whether ambient sound was leveraged intentionally for calming purposes, but for you, it creates a layered, immersive sensory experience, blending with the sights, smells, and textures around you. You move to a low shelf filled with dried herbs in bundles. Oddly, a tiny moth flits near the lavender, pausing as if inspecting it before continuing. Scholars still argue whether insects were merely tolerated, considered omens, or even incorporated in subtle ways, but their presence reminds you that life thrives in both the expected and the overlooked corners of the monastery. Near the back wall, a narrow alcove houses small jars labeled with faint, almost illegible handwriting. Oddly, one jar has a subtle chip in its rim, exposing pale clay beneath the glazed surface. Scholars still debate whether imperfections were regarded as insignificant or meaningful, but for you, noticing the imperfection adds texture, a tactile and visual detail that deepens your immersion in the space. You pause to observe a small basin filled with water for washing wounds. Oddly, the surface reflects sunlight in tiny, sparkling ripples, a delicate pattern constantly shifting. Scholars still argue whether the reflective quality of water was ever intentionally observed for meditation or purely incidental, but you find it hypnotically calming, a liquid mirror of movement and light. You wander along the walls, noting faint scratches and dents, evidence of centuries of labor, care, and human presence. Oddly, a small knot in the wood catches the light, appearing almost like a tiny eye watching silently. Scholars still debate whether such natural markings were ever imbued with meaning or merely aesthetic accidents, but your imagination latches onto it, giving the space a quiet, attentive personality. Near a narrow doorway leading to the garden, the scent of herbs grows stronger, mingling with the faint tang of water and earth. Oddly, a small snail moves along the stone threshold, leaving a delicate, glistening trail. Scholars still argue whether such creatures were considered beneficial, annoying, or inconsequential, but for you, the trail serves as a subtle reminder of time, patience, and slow persistence. Finally, you pause in the center of the infirmary, letting your senses absorb the room's details. The scent of herbs, the faint hum of distant activity, the textures of wood and stone, and the quiet movement of small animals. Oddly, the combination of sensory impressions, the warmth, the fragrance, the sound, and the light, creates a meditative harmony. Scholars may debate the design, function, or symbolic meaning of each element, but for you, the infirmary embodies care, attentiveness, and the quiet rhythm of life and healing within the monastery. You leave the infirmary and wander toward the monastery's refectory, the place where monks gather to eat, drink, and reflect quietly on their day. The room is long and rectangular, with wooden tables stretching down its length, benches neatly aligned. Oddly, the faint smell of yesterday's bread still lingers, a soft reminder of past meals. Scholars still debate whether medieval refectories were designed primarily for nourishment, contemplation, or social order, but you notice that the space somehow blends practicality with serenity, inviting measured steps and quiet attention. Sunlight pours through tall, narrow windows, casting patterns on the worn wooden floor. Oddly, a single beam catches a tiny fleck of dust floating in the air, illuminating it like a miniature, suspended star. Scholars still argue whether such moments were deliberately appreciated by monks for meditation or simply incidental, but your gaze lingers, giving your mind a gentle pause in the midst of movement. At one end of the refectory, a low shelf holds ceramic jugs, plates, and simple utensils. Oddly, one jug has a small crack along its side, carefully patched with wax. Scholars still debate whether repairs were purely functional, symbolic of resourcefulness, or an expression of respect for valued objects, but the imperfection draws your attention, reminding you that even in simplicity, care and patience were present. You wander down the length of the hall, noting the high beams of the ceiling. Oddly, a faint pattern of soot stains marks where candles or torches once flickered, leaving abstract streaks of shadow on the wood. Scholars still argue whether these marks were entirely accidental or subtly incorporated into the room's aesthetic, but for you, they provide texture and depth, a tangible connection to centuries of human presence. A small alcove contains a lectern, where a monk reads aloud during communal meals. Oddly, the monk's voice, soft and measured, echoes slightly against the stone walls, forming a gentle resonance. Scholars still debate whether acoustics were considered when designing monastic dining spaces, but the sound seems purposeful, lending a subtle rhythm to the ritual of eating and listening. Near a long table, remnants of dried herbs and grains hint at previous meals. Oddly, a single stray leaf has fallen onto the floor, curled delicately at the edges. Scholars still argue whether such details were ever observed by monks for symbolic purposes or dismissed as trivial, but you notice it, appreciating the small, almost poetic presence amid the larger, orderly space. A faint hum of wind drifts through the windows, mingling with the occasional creak of benches. Oddly, a loose floorboard amplifies the sound slightly, creating a soft percussive rhythm that harmonizes with your footsteps. Scholars still debate whether ambient noises like this were valued for their calming effect or merely incidental, but it slows your pace, letting your senses fully inhabit the hall. You pause at a side wall, noticing a series of small hooks where cloaks and simple garments hang. Oddly, one hook holds a tiny, worn piece of cloth, frayed at the edges, as if a monk had left it decades ago. Scholars still argue whether the preservation of personal items was intentional or accidental, but observing it feels like glimpsing a quiet echo of past lives, a subtle connection across time. In the center of the refectory, a large table is arranged for communal meals. Oddly, the surface bears faint scratches and dents, marks of countless knives and serving utensils. Scholars still debate whether such wear was regarded as a nuisance or a record of use, but you see it as a testament to routine, labor, and shared experience, a physical trace of centuries of daily life. Near a window, sunlight illuminates a small ceramic bowl, its glaze chipped slightly at the rim. Oddly, the light reflects off a tiny puddle of water, casting a dancing shimmer across the table. Scholars still argue whether reflective surfaces were appreciated consciously or merely incidental, but your mind lingers on the gentle play of light, a quiet meditation within the larger, structured environment. You wander toward a corner where a stack of wooden boards is stored, likely used for additional tables or repairs. Oddly, one board has a faint carved mark, a simple geometric design. Scholars still debate whether such carvings were decorative, symbolic, or casual doodles, but the tiny mark intrigues you, hinting at individual creativity within the collective order. A faint aroma of roasting grains drifts in from a small hearth at the end of the hall. Oddly, a single ember glows softly, its warmth subtle yet noticeable against the cool stone walls. Scholars still argue whether hearths were primarily functional, ceremonial, or both, but the glowing warmth adds a tactile dimension to the sensory experience, a quiet reminder of heat, labor, and sustenance. Near the benches, you notice faint carvings etched into the wood, initials and symbols left by monks long past. Oddly, one carving depicts a small, smiling face, its simplicity striking against the rigid lines of the surrounding marks. Scholars still debate whether such expressions were personal, playful, or ritualistic, but for you, it brings a humanizing touch, a fleeting glimpse of personality across the centuries. You wander along the edges of the room, observing small imperfections, a chipped tile, a slightly misaligned bench, a faded patch of wall where paint once clung. Oddly, the small deviations form a subtle rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the orderly rows of tables. Scholars still argue whether imperfections were tolerated intentionally or simply inevitable, but your mind notices the gentle irregularities, appreciating the balance between structure and variation. At the far end of the refectory, a low window reveals a patch of garden bathed in sunlight. Oddly, a single butterfly flits across a flower, pausing briefly before continuing its delicate flight. Scholars still debate whether garden views were integrated for aesthetic, spiritual, or practical reasons, but your gaze lingers, observing the tiny, fleeting movement, a soft reminder of life beyond stone walls. Finally, you pause in the center of the refectory, letting your senses take in the room's full composition. The smell of herbs and baked bread, the texture of worn wood, the flicker of sunlight, and the faint hum of distant activity. Oddly, the combination of sensory impressions, light, scent, sound, and tactile details, creates a layered, immersive experience. Scholars may debate the purpose or symbolism of every architectural choice, every scratch, and every ambient sound, but for you, the refectory embodies nourishment, ritual, and the quiet rhythm of daily monastic life, a space where time slows and observation deepens. You step out of the refectory and wander toward the cloister, the open-air heart of the monastery. Stone arches rise overhead, framing a central courtyard where grass, herbs, and flowers grow in careful patterns. Oddly, the scent of damp earth mixes with faint floral notes, a natural perfume that seems almost intentional. Scholars still debate whether cloisters were designed for meditation, processional movement, or merely to connect the different wings of the monastery, but for you, the space feels deliberately calming, a slow rhythm imposed on the passing hours. You walk along the covered walkway, your footsteps echoing softly against the flagstones. Oddly, a single leaf drifts down from a nearby tree, spinning lazily in the air before landing near your feet. Scholars still argue whether seasonal changes were observed and appreciated by monks as a spiritual metaphor or merely tolerated, but the leaf draws your attention to the slow, inevitable passage of time. A small fountain bubbles in the center of the courtyard, water spilling into a stone basin with a delicate, continuous murmur. Oddly, tiny ripples spread across the surface, reflecting sunlight in glimmering patterns. Scholars still debate whether the sound of water was deliberately incorporated for contemplation or naturally soothing effect, but your senses are drawn to the rhythmic motion and gentle music of flowing water. Along the edges of the courtyard, herbs grow in neat rows, their leaves brushing gently against one another in a light breeze. Oddly, a small snail winds its way along a stone path, glistening trail catching the sun. Scholars still argue whether such creatures were tolerated for their ecological roles or merely ignored, but for you, the tiny presence is meditative, a reminder that even small life participates in the monastery's quiet rhythm. You pause at a low bench beneath an arch, letting your gaze travel across the courtyard. Oddly, a patch of moss grows thickly along the base of a stone pillar, soft and velvety under your fingertips. Scholars still debate whether moss and other plant growth was considered aesthetically pleasing, spiritually symbolic, or simply inevitable in a damp climate, but the softness invites you to pause and reflect. A faint flutter of wings draws your attention. A small bird lands atop a garden wall, pecking delicately at a crumb left by the wind. Oddly, it pauses, head cocked, observing you for a moment before taking flight again. Scholars still argue whether bird activity in cloisters was noticed symbolically or dismissed as incidental, but the brief interaction connects you to the vibrant, living ecosystem that surrounds the monastery. You wander to a corner where sunlight filters through a lattice of vines climbing the stone wall. Oddly, tiny buds glimmer like green jewels, catching the light in brief flashes. Scholars still debate whether the cultivation of vines had purely practical, ornamental, or symbolic significance, but for you, the delicate play of light and shadow enhances the sense of peace, a visual rhythm accompanying the quiet sounds of the courtyard. Near the cloister's edge, you notice a small stone bench etched with faint initials and symbols, a trace of monks long past. Oddly, one etching depicts a tiny star, carefully carved with surprising detail. Scholars still argue whether such carvings were devotional, playful, or simply an outlet for idle hands, but observing them bridges centuries, connecting you to the human presence that shaped every corner of this space. A gentle breeze rustles the leaves of trees surrounding the courtyard, and you notice tiny shadows dancing across the flagstones. Oddly, a single fallen petal lands near your foot, its delicate pink hue stark against the gray stone. Scholars still debate whether such natural events were interpreted symbolically by monks, but for you, the petal adds a quiet punctuation to your wandering, a reminder of fleeting beauty. You move toward a small doorway leading into the chapter house, the place where monks gather to discuss daily affairs and recite formal prayers. Oddly, the doorway is framed by carvings worn smooth with centuries of use, each groove a subtle record of countless hands passing through. Scholars still argue whether ware was considered venerable or accidental, but your fingers tracing the smooth stone make the past feel tactile, immediate, almost intimate. Inside, the chapter house is cool and dimly lit. Oddly, the faint aroma of waxed wood and old parchment mingles with the lingering scent of incense. Scholars still debate whether scent was used deliberately to focus attention or merely a byproduct of ritual, but for you, the mixture enhances a sense of reverent stillness. Monks sit in semicircular benches, their quiet murmurs forming a subtle ambient hum. Oddly, a lone quill scratches across parchment in the far corner, a rhythm slightly faster than the surrounding soundscape. Scholars still argue whether isolated activity was ignored or deliberately accommodated to maintain workflow, but you notice the contrast, appreciating the interplay of motion and silence. A small alcove contains a lectern with an open manuscript, its pages catching stray sunlight from a narrow window. Oddly, one page bears a tiny illustration of a smiling monk offering bread, whimsical and human in the otherwise austere space. Scholars still debate whether marginalia carried moral, instructional, or humorous intent, but your eyes linger, the small detail creating a connection across time, a playful whisper from a past observer. You rise and step back into the cloister, feeling the warmth of late afternoon sunlight brushing your shoulders. Oddly, a single blade of grass sways just enough to cast a tiny, moving shadow, a subtle dance in an otherwise orderly world. Scholars still argue whether such minute observations mattered to medieval minds, but for you, the motion becomes a gentle meditation, a slow rhythm mirroring your breathing. Along the walkway, you pause to notice the interplay of light and shadow on the stone walls. Oddly, the pattern seems to shift as clouds move, forming temporary geometric shapes and angles. Scholars still debate whether architectural features were intentionally designed to interact with sunlight or if it was merely a happy coincidence, but the visual dance keeps your mind occupied in the most gentle, immersive way. Finally, you reach the central fountain again, pausing to sit on the edge, feeling the cool stone beneath you. Oddly, a single ripple travels across the water, catching sunlight in a fleeting sparkle. Scholars still argue whether the movement of water was ever consciously observed for symbolic reflection, but for you, the simple motion is hypnotic, slowing time and settling the mind, a perfect rhythm to end the day's wandering. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the smells, sights, and subtle sounds of the monastery wash over you. Oddly, in this moment, even the tiniest details, the sway of a leaf, the glint of sunlight, the faint creak of stone, seem magnified, weaving together into a quiet tapestry of life, labor, and meditation. Scholars may debate the function, symbolism, or design of every space, but for you, the monastery becomes a living, breathing organism, inviting rest, reflection, and gentle surrender. You rise from the fountain and step slowly back into the quiet cloister, letting the sounds, smells, and light settle around you like a soft blanket. The breeze stirs faintly, rustling leaves and carrying the scent of herbs and earth. Oddly, even the smallest sounds, a distant bird, the whisper of wind, a leaf brushing against stone, seem amplified in their gentle presence, as if the monastery itself is breathing alongside you. Scholars might debate the function of each space, each architectural choice, each careful placement of light, but now, none of that matters. You pause, feeling the weight of centuries pressing softly on your shoulders. Oddly, a stray sunbeam catches a tiny fragment of dust, illuminating it like a suspended star. You watch it float, tiny and slow, a perfect meditation on stillness and impermanence. Scholars still argue about monastic life, its rituals, its strictures, and its spaces, but for you, all of that fades into the background. What remains is quiet, observation, and a deep, unspoken connection to countless lives that walked these halls long before you. The stone beneath your hands is cool and grounding. Oddly, even the smallest imperfections, the worn edges of a bench, a crack in the wall, the gentle ripple of the fountain, become comforting reminders that life is layered, textured, and beautifully imperfect. Your breathing slows, in harmony with the rhythm of the monastery, with the flutter of leaves, with the soft hum of distant activity. As twilight softens the sky outside, you sink into the feeling of ease, letting your mind drift along the gentle currents of scent, sound, and light. Oddly, you feel both present and untethered, connected to the slow, meditative heartbeat of this ancient space. Sweet dreams.